Part 5. The Great High School Rebellion. 21. Riot Nights on Sunset Strip, 1966 to 1968. A moment in rock and roll dreamtime. Saturday night on the Sunset Strip, a few weeks before Christmas in 1967. Along that famous 12 blocks of unincorporated Los Angeles County between Hollywood and Beverly Hills, new names blazed in the neon firmament. The Byrds, the Doors, Sonny and Cher, the Mamas and the Papas, and Buffalo Springfield. But the real spectacle was out on the street. Several thousand demonstrators peacefully and exuberantly snaking their way west along Sunset, then circling back to their starting point at Pandora's Box Coffee House, 8180 Sunset, just inside the LA city limits. On one side of the boundary between the city of LA and the county territory, several hundred riot-helmeted sheriff's deputies massed. On the other side, an equal number of LAPD, fidgeting nervously with their nightsticks as if they were confronting angry strikers or an unruly mob, instead of friendly 15-year-olds with long hair and acne. The demonstrators, relentlessly caricatured as striplings, teeny boppers, and even hoodlums by hostile cops and their allies in the daily press, were a cross-section of white teenage Southern California. Movie brats from the gilded hills above the Strip mingled with auto workers' daughters from Van Nuys and truck drivers' sons from Pomona. There were some college students and a few uncomfortable crew-cut servicemen, but most were high school age, 15 to 18, and thus technically liable to arrest after 10 p.m., when dual county and city juvenile curfews took effect. Kids carried hand-lettered signs that read, "Stop Blue Fascism," "Abolish the Curfew," and "Free the Strip." The demonstration had been called, but scarcely organized, by RAMCOM, the Right of Assembly and Movement Committee, headquartered in the Fifth Estate Coffee House, 8226 Sunset. The coffee house's manager, Al Mitchell, acted as the adult spokesman for the high school students and teenage runaways who clustered around the Fifth Estate and Pandora's Box a block away. This was the fifth in a series of weekend demonstrations, perhaps more accurately, happenings, that had protested a year-long campaign by sheriffs and police to clear the Strip of loitering teenagers. In response to complaints from local restaurateurs and landowners, the cops trawled nightly, after the early curfew, for under 18s. They targeted primarily the long-haired kids in beads, granny glasses, and tie-dyed shirts. It had become the cops' custom to humiliate curfew violators with insults and obscene jokes, pull their long hair, brace them against squad cars, and even choke them with billy clubs before hauling them down to the West Hollywood sheriffs or the Hollywood police stations, where they would be held until their angry parents picked them up. This evening, December 10th, however, had so far passed peacefully, with more smiles exchanged than insults or blows. The high point had been the appearance of Sonny and Cher, dressed like high-fashion Inuit in huge fleece parkas, waving support to adoring kids. Later, after photographs appeared on front pages across the world, the city of Monterey Park reneged on a previous agreement and banned Sonny and Cher from their Rose Parade float for this gesture of solidarity with rioting teeny boppers. By midnight, the demonstration had returned to Pandora's, and a happy Al Mitchell had officially declared the protest over. As the crowd began to disperse, LAPD officers entered Pandora's to check IDs. Eason Monroe, head of the Southern California chapter of the ACLU, complained that they were acting illegally. Pandora's didn't serve alcohol, and the curfew ordinance exempted teenagers inside licensed businesses. The response of the cops was to handcuff and arrest Monroe. When Michael Vossi, a PR agent for the Beach Boys who was acting as a legal observer for an entertainment industry support group, spoke up in Monroe's defense, he was pummeled by another officer. The few hundred remaining demonstrators outside Pandora's shouted at the police to leave their adult supporters alone. Riot-equipped police reinforcements converged from all sides. Paul J. Robbins, another adult supporter, from the awkwardly titled Community Action for Facts and Freedom, CAF, whose members were a veritable who's who of the liberal pop culture scene, A few days later described in the Free Press the unprovoked fury of the LAPD's attack on panic-stricken and fleeing protesters. After Robbins himself was hit by a police baton, he watched in horror as police flailed away at a helpless teenager. "I saw a kid holding a sign in both hands jerk forward as though struck from behind. He fell into the path of the officers, and 4 or 5 of them immediately began bludgeoning him with clubs held in one hand. I stood transfixed, watching him as the officers continued beating him while he attempted to alternately protect himself and crawl forward. Finally, he slumped against a wall as the officer continued to beat him. Before I was spun around and set reeling forward again, I saw him picked up, belly down, by the officers and carried away." Later, legal representatives of CAF measured a trail of blood 75 yards long leading from this spot to the point where he was placed in a car. Where is he now? The night's peaceful demonstration had been wantonly turned into another of those police massacres for which Los Angeles was becoming justly notorious. 6 months earlier had been the now infamous attack on thousands of peace demonstrators at Century City. The 2 daily newspapers, the LA Times and the Hearst-owned Herald Examiner, as usual, characterized the unwarranted police aggression as a teeny-bopper-inspired riot. Gossip columnist Norma Lee Browning, writing in the faraway Chicago Tribune, predicted the end of Hollywood's Great White Way as barefoot bearded boobs who are more far out than ordinary beatniks rioted and scared away upscale diners and club customers. She estimated that the Playboy Club's business is off 25% from last year. Mitchell and the other adult supporters, meanwhile, were so appalled by the police brutality that they called off the next weekend's planned demonstration out of fear that the police might yet kill or seriously injure one of the kids. After 2 months of political debate, litigation, and frustrating negotiations, the protests resumed, massively, in February 1967, and continued episodically through the autumn of 1968. Thousands of kids would be arrested for curfew violations, and American International Pictures would immortalize the riots in a camp film, Riot on Sunset Strip, 1967, with a haunting soundtrack. From mobsters to hippies. This legendary Battle of the Strip, from 1966 to 1968, was the most celebrated episode in the struggle of teenagers of all colors during the 1960s and 1970s to create their own realm of freedom and carnivalesque sociality within the Southern California night. There were other memorable contestations with business and police, over Griffith Park love-ins, beach parties, interracial concerts, countercultural neighborhoods like Venice Beach, head shopping districts, LA's Haight-Ashbury on Fairfax, cruising strips, Whittier, Hollywood, and Van Nuys boulevards, street racing locales, and the myriad local hangouts where kids quietly or brazenly defied parents, police, and curfews. Of course, such battles were not a new story. Los Angeles had passed its first juvenile curfew in the 1880s. Nor were they unique to Southern California. But post-war California motorized youth rebellion. A culture of cars, high-speed freeways, centrifugal sprawl, and featureless suburbs generated a vast ennui among bored but mobile teenagers. Any hint of excitement on a weekend evening might draw kids from anywhere in the 100-odd-mile radius of local AM radio. Thus, when one rock station incautiously advertised a party at Malibu Beach in 1961, nearly 20,000 teenagers showed up, and then rioted when sheriffs ordered them to leave. Nor is it surprising, after the strip riots were celebrated in song by Stephen Stills in 1966. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. As well as in time and life, that the 8,000 and 9,000 blocks of Sunset Boulevard became an even more powerful magnet to alienated kids from the valleys and flatlands. Indeed, decades later, to claim that you had been busted on the Strip in 66 or 67 was the Southern California equivalent of boasting that you had been at Woodstock. But why the Strip? The parents of many Southern California teenagers in 1966 had their own lustrous memories of a night, returning from the Pacific War in 1943 or after college graduation in 1951, when they had dined, danced, and rubbed shoulders with celebrity in one of the famed Sunset Boulevard nightclubs such as Ciro's, Macombo, or the Trocadero. The Strip, one of those strange county holes in the Los Angeles urban fabric, was for a generation the major center of movie colony nightlife, and thus the epicenter of tabloid scandal and romance. It was also a city-state run by famed gamblers and their gangster allies in league with a corrupt sheriff's department. During its most glamorous years, from 1939 to 1954, the Strip's informal mayor was the indestructible Mickey Cohen, prince of gamblers and king of survivors. Operating from a haberdashery in the 8800 block of Sunset, Cohen defied all odds by emerging unscathed from an incredible series of mob ambushes and bombings that took the lives of half a dozen of his bodyguards. By the late 1950s, however, Cohen was cooling his heels in the pen, and the Strip was in steep decline. Las Vegas, thanks to Bugsy Siegel, had usurped the lucrative symbiosis of movie stars and mobsters that the Strip had pioneered, and hijacked its star chefs and famous entertainers. Yet precisely as urban decay was taking a huge bite out of its golden mile, the popular television show, 77 Sunset Strip, generated a new mythology. Ed Cookie Burns, the program's Elvis-like co-star, who played a parking lot jockey who was also a part-time sleuth, briefly became the biggest youth celebrity in the country. The Strip was portrayed as a dazzling nocturnal crossroads for a handsome Corvette and surfboard set. In fact, the Strip, like the larger Hollywood community, was in transition between its golden age and two competing strategies for reusing vacant nightclub and restaurant space. The Times Square option was to reopen clubs with topless or later nude dancers. The Body Shop, a burlesque house in the 1940s, was revived and soon became the flagship of the new XXX-rated exhibitionism. The other option, more unconventional, was to cater to juvenile audiences with rock music. Centralizing the youth club scene was doubly useful to rock producers, allowing them to talent scout new bands while developing those already under contract. The success of 77 Sunset Strip, moreover, established a national cachet and name recognition for groups weaned on the Strip. In 1965, the county reluctantly acceded to club owners and record companies' pleas and created a tiered licensing system that allowed 18 to 21-year-olds inside clubs where alcohol was served, while creating special liquorless music venues for younger 15 to 18-year-olds. The youth club scene promptly exploded. For older teenagers and young adults, the premier clubs were the Whiskey A Go-Go, Gazzarri's, and the Galaxy. The newly baptized teeny boppers favored its boss, formerly the renowned Ciro's, the Trip, formerly Crescendo, and Sea Witch, as well as cheap atmospheric coffee houses like Pandora's, owned by former tennis star Bill Tilden, and the Fifth Estate, bankrolled by teen magazine mogul Robert Peterson. As the clubs inexorably hiked their cover charges, younger and poorer kids preferred simply to be part of the colorful street scene, wandering in groups down Sunset or hovering near club entrances for a glimpse of Jim Morrison or Neil Young. As the nightly teen crowds grew larger, however, the Strip's upscale restaurant owners and their wealthy adult clientele began to protest about the lack of parking and the increasing sidewalk congestion. Beverly Hills matrons and Century City lawyers recoiled from contact with the beatified throngs. Moreover, at this point, wrote Edgar Friedenberg and Anthony Bernhard in an account of the riots, the good behavior of the teeny boppers had become a problem. Because the kids were generally not hostile, aggressive, nor disorderly, there was no obvious pretext for driving them off the Strip. Eventually, the Sunset Strip Chamber of Commerce and the Sunset Plaza Association, representing landlords and restaurant owners, cajoled the sheriff's department to stringently enforce a youth curfew. During the 1940s, when teenage B-girls were a national scandal, both the city and county had adopted parallel curfew regulations that forbade anyone under 18 from loitering in public after 10 p.m. Loitering, Friedenberg and Bernhard noted, is defined as to idle, to lag, to stand idly by, or to walk, drive, or ride about aimlessly and without purpose. A definition that may well make the entire solar system illegal. The crackdown begins. The West Hollywood Sheriff's Station, responding to the complaints of businesses and landowners, began its crackdown on strip kids in September 1965. By the following summer, the sheriffs, joined by the LAPD in the adjacent Hollywood and Fairfax districts, were mounting weekend sweeps with hundreds of officers, an effort that far exceeded the attention given to mobsters in the Mickey Cohen era. The sheriffs, in fact, were reputed allies of Cohen. Curfew arrests soared into the thousands, with 300 hauled away from the sidewalks outside Cantor's restaurant on Fairfax on a single July evening. "It was just like shooting ducks in a duck pond," boasted one deputy. When the city's largest newspaper needed a dramatic image for a story about the teenage hordes, the deputies obligingly arrested 10 kids and stood them handcuffed in a line for the direct accommodation of the Los Angeles Times. Throughout the spring and summer, Renata Adler reported in a later New Yorker article, licenses permitting minors to be served anything at all were revoked at one place after another. Several of these places reluctantly went adult and topless, a change that seemed to cause the authorities no distress. Indeed, it was widely rumored that the kids were being cleared off the strip to make way for the return of mob-connected sex entertainment and for more serious, less conspicuous forms of vice than lingering after curfew. Shortly after Halloween, a couple of angry teenagers decided it was time to organize a formal protest against the arbitrary arrests and police abuse of kids on the strip. They printed a flyer, "Protest Police Mistreatment of Youth on Sunset Boulevard. No more shackling of 14 and 15-year-olds," calling for a demonstration the night of Saturday, November 12th. It was at this point that Al Mitchell, the leftist ex-merchant sailor and filmmaker who managed the Fifth Estate for Robert Peterson, became their informal sponsor. Cans were soon being circulated around the coffee house to raise money for additional leaflets. Rock stations began to luridly warn that a major riot was brewing, and cautioned kids away from the strip on the 12th. This was irresistible publicity for a demonstration whose urgency was underlined by the arrest of 80 kids for curfew violations on Friday night. The next evening, by 9 p.m., according to the Freep, more than 3,000 teenagers, flanked by adult curiosity seekers and hostile servicemen, gathered in front of Pandora's. Aside from a handful of placards hastily painted at the Fifth Estate a few hours before the demonstration, there was no apparent organization or leadership. In the spirit of the times, the protest had been conceived as a spontaneous happening, or flash mob, avant la lettre, and the overwhelming majority of the crowd complied with its peaceful purpose. At one point, the police called a fire company to the scene, and some of the kids nervously asked the firefighters whether they were going to hose them. A bemused fire captain replied, "Have a good time and let me go home." The engine left. The overflow of protesters onto Sunset and Crescent Heights boulevards created a traffic jam. Several bus drivers angrily honked and screamed at the kids. In response, demonstrators climbed up and danced on the roofs of the buses. One youth scrawled, "Free the 15-year-olds" on a windshield. Another broke a window with a fire extinguisher. On the fringe of the crowd, there was a brief scuffle between long-haired protesters and some young sailors and Marines. Shortly after 10 p.m., 100 cops used their nightsticks to roughly clear the sidewalks. Police with drawn revolvers chased kids into Pandora's. Panicky protesters who tried to retreat westward down Sunset collided with a wall of riot-ready sheriffs, and about 50 were arrested. The LAPD declared a tactical alert the next evening, closing Sunset from Fairfax to Crescent Heights. State Highway Patrol officers and private Pinkerton guards reinforced the sheriff's side of the line. Thanks to wildly escalating rumors in the station houses, the atmosphere was irrationally tense, and the Freep reported that many of the officers seemed to be in a state of panic. While Al Mitchell shot footage for his documentary Blue Fascism, 300 or so protesters jeered, "Gestapo! Gestapo!" at the police line, and then dispersed after they were declared an unlawful assembly. They vowed to return the following weekend. On Monday morning, it was the turn of the establishment to riot. Although a handful of protesters had been involved in the bus incident, total estimated damage $158, the Herald Examiner's headline screamed, "Long Hair Nightmare, Juvenile Violence on Sunset Strip." A Times editorial likewise warned of anarchy on Sunset Strip and blamed the teenagers and their senseless, destructive riot for a sorry ending for the boulevard that was once Hollywood's most dazzling area. The Times also gave much space to the melodramatic claims of Captain Charlie Crumley, commander of the LAPD's Hollywood division, that left-wing groups and outside agitators had organized the protest. Crumley also asserted that there are over 1,000 hoodlums living like bums in Hollywood, advocating such things as free love, legalized marijuana, and abortion. Los Angeles, in the eyes of its establishment, suddenly seemed like a besieged patriarchy. Hollywood councilman Paul Lamport demanded a full-scale investigation into Crumley's charges of a subversive plot, while his county counterpart, Supervisor Ernest Debs, ranted that whatever it takes is going to be done. We're going to be tough. We're not going to surrender that area or any area to beatniks or wild-eyed kids. The Sunset Plaza Association, representing strip restaurant owners, called for a city crackdown on such kid hangouts as Pandora's and the Fifth Estate that offered sanctuary to protesting teenagers across the county/city border. Only the Free Press challenged the Daily Press's characterization of the previous weekend's police disturbance as a teeny-bopper riot. To the editorial writers of the Times, sitting in their bald majesty on First Street, entirely isolated from the events, unable to properly evaluate or analyze them, it is only possible to say, "You are stupid old men who make reckless and irresponsible statements that can only make a bad situation worse." The kids, the weekly claimed, were actually caught in the middle of an economic conflict between the Sunset Strip Chamber of Commerce, with its ties to the adult entertainment industry, on one hand, and the Sunset Strip Association, representing the youth venues, on the other. The police, in effect, have been cooperating with one very wealthy group of property owners on the Strip against a less powerful group of businessmen. The lopsidedness of the battle was further demonstrated when the LA City Council unanimously acceded to the Sunset Plaza Association's request and voted to use eminent domain to demolish Pandora's box. At the same time, Sheriff Peter Pitches and Supervisor Debs lobbied the County Public Welfare Commission to veto the renewal of the permits allowing music clubs on the Strip to admit under 21s. When the commission balked, the supervisors themselves rescinded the offending ordinance and effectively banned teenagers from the clubs. Suddenly, Los Angeles's celebrated rock renaissance itself was under threat, and this quickly galvanized the younger generation of music producers and agents into unexpected solidarity with the next wave of protests on the Strip. Although the second weekend of protests, November 18th to 20th, 1966, again pitted thousands of flower children against huge phalanxes of police and sheriffs, the still leaderless protesters broadcast enough seductive warmth, as well as carnival-like mirth, to take the grim edge off the evening. As they marched down the Strip, they handed out flowers and blew bubbles and kisses. Art students passed out leaflets proposing a series of happenings based on the implications of certain works by Alan Capro and Wolf Vostell. A continuous environment benediction service, a RIOT band playing in the streets, giving of a temperance lecture, couples kissing, passing out of old photographs, savage chanting of the word art, having tables of clay where passers-by can model male and female genitals, and so on. The cops seemed disarmed by the happy mood, although at 10 p.m. a sheriff's sound truck began warning under-18s to clear the street or be arrested. Hundreds of kids resolutely faced off a cordon of deputies, police, and Navy Shore Patrol around the Crescent Heights and Sunset intersection. Although several score of curfew violators were ultimately arrested, there were no baton charges, and the crowd, still in surprisingly good humor, dispersed by 2 a.m. There were widespread rumors, however, that the business interests were upset with the evening's outcome, and that the sheriffs were under pressure to use more aggressive tactics the next weekend. The music industry responds. To forestall the expected violence against their fans, a group of concerned celebrities and music industry executives went into a huddle the following Friday. The meeting was called by Jim Dixon, manager of the Byrds, who took full-time leave to organize Community Action for Facts and Freedom. CAF's initial membership included Dixon's partner, Ed Ticker, the ubiquitous Al Mitchell, the Whiskey's co-owner, Elmer Valentine, Sonny and Cher's manager, Brian Stone, television star Bob Denver, millionaire sportsman and Woolworth heir Lance Reventlow, a member of the Sheriff's Aero Squadron, and Beach Boys Enterprises' Michael Vossi and David Anderley. The meager political clout of the club owners was now dramatically augmented by support from the top bands and music industry leaders. CAF decided to mobilize its members and friends to attend the next evening's demonstration as legal observers in yellow armbands. A group of sympathetic Hollywood ministers and the local chapter of the ACLU promised to pitch in as well. In the event, sheriff's deputies ran amok, giving CAF and some 30 clergy a shocking exhibition of the abuse that the kids have been complaining about all year. People were viciously clubbed and beaten, wrote the Freep's Brian Carr. There was no plan or purpose evident in the beatings or the subsequent arrests. It seemed the handiest people, with no regard given to age, sex, or social position, were clubbed, punched, and/or arrested. The immensely popular Bob Denver, a one-time mailman and former teacher before becoming a star as Maynard G. Krebs on The Many Lives of Dobie Gillis, 1959 to 1963, then as Gilligan on Gilligan's Island, 1964 to 67, was left almost speechless by the scene. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable, he mumbled, as deputies spat on a woman in his group, then charged down the street to baton some harmless teens. Peter Fonda, who was filming outside the Fifth Estate with actor Brandon DeWilde, was arrested with 27 others, mainly adults, as they watched the LAPD emulating the sheriffs. Man, the kids have had it, Fonda later told reporters. Meanwhile, inside the lobby of the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station, Brian Stone, who was already a legend for his creation of Sonny and Cher as well as Buffalo Springfield, was arrested for refusing a demand to produce identification. His business partner, Charlie Green, was in turn busted for protesting Stone's arrest. Before the night was over, the sheriffs and LAPD together had made enemies of one of the most powerful, if unconventional, industries in Los Angeles. As the mamas and the papas later explained to reporters, even millionaire rock stars could no longer drive down the street with any feeling of safety from harassment. The even more promiscuous police violence at the December 10th protest, described at the beginning of this chapter, solidified CAF's apprehension that blue fascism posed a direct threat to Los Angeles's billion-dollar rock culture. As the city council and board of supervisors forged ahead with their plans to bulldoze Pandora's and gut the strip club scene, CAF joined with the club owners and the ACLU in an ultimately successful legal defense of the status quo ante. If the Times red-baited the long-haired protesters as dupes of the left-wing W.E.B. Du Bois clubs, AM stations fought back with a dramatic recording of a defiant teenager saying, "It's our constitutional guarantee to walk unmolested on Sunset Strip," as he was being bundled into a sheriff's car. And within a few weeks, tens of millions of teenagers across the world were listening to the haunting words, "Stop children, what's that sound?" of the Buffalo Springfield battle anthem of the Strip, For What It's Worth. Meanwhile, Al Mitchell and CAF, supported by the Freeps Art Kunken, suspended demonstrations over the Christmas holiday while they held peace talks with county officials. Verbal progress on that end, however, was undercut by what was widely seen as an escalation of police pressure on youth and adult countercultures throughout the Los Angeles area. In mid-December, for example, Pasadena police raided the popular Catacombs Art Gallery and arrested 100 young people on a variety of drug charges, many of them utterly bogus. Then, on New Year's Eve, the LAPD Vice Squad rampaged through the gay bars in the Silver Lake district, roughing up and arresting scores of patrons. The LAPD also increased its illegal harassment of the Freeps sales force. Despite a city ordinance authorizing them to sell papers from the curb to passing cars, Freep vendors were systematically ticketed and frequently arrested, especially on the Strip and in front of Pandora's. Since local television and the two dailies had blacked out images of police brutality, the Freep, together with a few rock stations and the local Pacifica franchise, KPFK-FM, were truly the alternative media. Persecution, moreover, only made the Freep vendors into heroes and boosted the paid circulation of the paper above 65,000, a phenomenal figure for the underground press. Back to the street. The phony war on the Strip lasted until the end of February, when Al Mitchell announced that we must go on to the streets again. Police and sheriff's deputies have again and again violated the terms of a truce Ramcom and other concerned groups negotiated on 16 December with the Los Angeles Crime and Delinquency Commission. Indeed, Captain Victor Rousseau of the West Hollywood Sheriff's Department humiliated the commission when he publicly renounced the truce or any other constraint on the vigorous enforcement of the curfew law. The county's earlier attempt to outlaw teenagers from rock clubs by ordinance had been ruled unconstitutional. So sheriffs and police were once more under terrific pressure from property owners to use brute force to drive the kids off the Strip. Mitchell was particularly outraged at repeated raids on the Fifth Estate and other alcohol-free coffee houses. Some 80,000 leaflets calling for a demonstration on Saturday night, February 11, 1967, saturated the clubs and circulated clandestinely through every high school in the county. For the first time, organizers undertook strategic planning to broaden the base of the protests to incorporate the grievances of gays and people of color. As the Freep noted, one of the most interesting and pace-setting reactions to the call to demonstrate came early this week from homosexual organizations who are currently up in arms about New Year's Eve's police raids on a number of Silver Lake area gay bars. Two leading gay groups, Pride and the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, endorsed the February demonstration and added plans for their own simultaneous march along Sunset and Silver Lake. Mitchell's loosely knit Ramcom group also plotted actions in Watts, East LA, and Pacoima in the hope that angry Black and Chicano youth would be drawn to participate. The self-concept of the Strip movement was shifting from an amorphous happening to an all-embracing coalition of outcast and police-persecuted street cultures. A crude attempt was made by the LAPD to frame the movement's principal adult leader. 10 days before the scheduled demonstrations, Al Mitchell, a veteran of harassment for such offenses as allowing singing in the Fifth Estate and obscene anti-police graffiti in its lavatories, was arrested, but not booked, on suspicion of 150 counts of statutory rape. The 40-ish leftist, whom the Times had caricatured as the muezzin of the teeny boppers, was now unmasked as a sinister sex criminal preying on his teenager followers. Or so it was claimed on radio and television news. In fact, Mitchell's 17-year-old accuser quickly confessed that her allegations were lies told in anger after she had been thrown out of the Fifth Estate for drug use. The Freep pondered why Mitchell had been so brazenly arrested and demonized in the media before the LAPD had even checked out the teenager's story. In any event, the hubbub around Mitchell did not deter more than 3,000 teenagers, along with unprecedented numbers of college students and adults, from once again assembling in front of Pandora's on Saturday night. For the first time, there was an organized rally, with speeches by Mitchell, civil liberties lawyer Marvin Chan, and ACLU counsel Phil Kroner, as well as an ingenious tactical plan. Every hour, new contingents of protesters were sent west on the county strip, where sheriff's deputies, impassive for the most part, allowed them to march without harassment. The demonstrators, carrying signs that read, "Stop beating the flower children" and "Stop blue fascism," were both exuberant and disciplined. Vivid refutation of the hoary myth of wild-eyed, drug-crazed rioters. Meanwhile, 500 protesters in front of the Black Cat gay bar at the corner of Sunset and Hyperion were making history as speakers urged gays to make a unified community stand in Silver Lake against brutality. But unfortunately, the other protest venues were flops. Only a desultory crowd turned out in Venice, where most residents had preferred to join the main action on the strip. And in Pacoima, a small group of hapless ram-com kids with good intentions but poor communication skills were set upon and beaten by local gang members. The Freep could find no evidence of any protests in either Watts or East LA. This did not mean, however, that the strip protests had no impact upon the ghettos and barrios. Black and Chicano flower children were beginning to integrate the strip in small numbers, despite frequent racist treatment from club bouncers and, of course, cops. And some black leaders, both moderate and radical, were rallying to the idea, pushed by Mitchell and New Left groups, that there really was new ground for a broad, anti-police abuse coalition. In March, after another large protest on the strip, Georgia legislator and civil rights hero Julian Bond spoke to admiring youth at the Fifth Estate while cops loomed threateningly on the periphery in riot gear. From February onward, every protest on the strip self-consciously identified itself with the victims of far more deadly police brutality in South Central LA. Radical groups, especially SDS and the International Socialists, began to play more prominent roles in the protests and actively recruited high school-age memberships. But many Angelenos had no inkling that mass protests, larger than ever, were continuing on the strip. In April, the latest addition to the local alternative media, Los Angeles Underground, bannered the huge headline, "Strip War. News Blackout Conceals Struggle. Police Sabotage Truce Agreement." The paper excoriated the Herald Examiner, but even more the Times, for their refusal to print a word about the huge but now disciplined demonstrations on the strip. The Times, however, did continue its vilification of youth culture. Teeny boppers had now metamorphosed into hippies, with constant stories and editorials of the ilk, "Hippies blamed for decline of the Sunset Strip." Furthermore, the Times warned, the bell-bottomed hordes were now poised to invade and presumably destroy Hollywood as well. Much attention was given to a speech that a local real estate appraiser, Robert Steele, had made on May 17th, charging that long-haired teens had done more damage than the Watts rioters 2 years earlier. Steele claimed that the under-18 youth had reduced property values along the strip by 30% and scared away potential major investors, including a large savings and loan company. The Times, at least, was accurate in pointing out new hotspots in Hollywood where property owners were squaring off against new youth venues, notably Hullabaloo, a vast rock emporium that sometimes featured a dozen popular bands in all-night marathons. On July 28, 1967, the LAPD, using elaborate decoys and commando tactics, had swept down upon the ticket lines at Hullabaloo and arrested 200 fans for curfew violations, although their IDs were only checked at the station. As usual, the incident went unreported in the Times, but it sent shockwaves through the music world and revived calf-type interest in defending the industry's local fandom. 1968 was year 3 of the struggle, and the baby sisters and brothers of the original protesters were now on the front line. No one could much recall what a beatnik was, but hippie-phobia was reaching a crescendo, with the Times, as usual, providing a rich diet of innuendo and stereotype. Yet the immense engines of the culture industry were slowly turning the great ship of mainstream taste around. Straight young adults, from secretaries to longshoremen, were quietly letting their hair grow and putting on bell-bottoms. The young sailors and Marines who a few years before had waylaid unwary teeny boppers in the Strip's back alleys were now happily trading drugs with their hippie connections. Store owners and restaurateurs who once had apoplexy at the sight of a madras-clothed teeny bopper now considered them as familiar as the palm trees. As the mainstream went countercultural, much of the counterculture, including its music, moved, however temporarily, to the political left. The LAPD and the sheriffs had to shift deployments to deal with the new specters of the Black Panther Party in South Central and high school unrest on the East Side. Curfew enforcement on the Strip became a less urgent law enforcement priority. Although police harassment would continue for another decade or more, the Strip War came to a climax on September 28, 1968, the day after Huey Newton had been sentenced to prison. This time, the protest was organized by the new Peace and Freedom Party, which gave equal billing to 3 demands: free the Strip, end police brutality, free Huey Newton. Flower power had become all power to the people, and kids boldly shoved "fuck the sheriffs" and "no more murder of black people" placards into the faces of their old tormentors. For the first time, the shoe was on the other foot. For an hour or more, protesters besieged the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station, whose denizens locked inside or on the roof toting shotguns were clueless as to how the lambs had suddenly turned into little lions. 22. The Blowouts, 1966 to 1968. In 1915, the city of Los Angeles annexed a hilly area on its northeastern periphery where sheep ranches and strawberry fields were starting to give way to cheap tract homes. It was known as Bairdstown, but developers and realtors, busy branding the landscape with romantic evocations of a mythic Spanish California, renamed it El Sereno. Many of its early residents were Italian Americans from neighboring Lincoln Heights, but Mexicans were excluded by the restrictive covenants that white-walled new subdivisions. When the U.S. Supreme Court overruled the California Supreme Court in a landmark 1948 case, Shelley v. Kramer, and prohibited racial covenants, Mexican families began to trickle in. By the 1960s, Spanish surname kids were the majority at Wilson High School on Eastern Avenue, which, in addition to El Sereno, served the City Terrace and Ramona Gardens neighborhoods. Unlike the older East Side high schools, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Garfield, that until the 1950s had long histories of integrated and diverse student bodies, Jews, Mexicans, Japanese, Russians, Filipinos, Okies, and blacks, Wilson, opened in 1937, had experienced a difficult transition from its original Anglo enrollment. Although it was sometimes considered the middle-class Mexican-American high school, its students confronted the same barriers to graduation and college admission as kids in the 3 older high schools: the banning of Spanish on campus, a curriculum that excluded Mexican history and customs, impossibly overcrowded classes, low reading scores, culturally biased testing, wanton use of corporal punishment, and the tracking of Mexican students, whatever their potential, into vocational classes to make them replacements for their fathers and mothers in low-wage jobs. White teachers, the overwhelming majority at Wilson, had little understanding or even sympathy with the students, and some, resentful of the change in the school's ethnic composition, were blatantly racist. The tiny group of Mexican-American teachers and white progressives who saw the need for reform faced the rock wall of an authoritarian school administration. Revolts are often detonated by events that initially seem to be small, or even trivial. Attacks on tea, rumors of aristocratic plots, maggots in sailors' food, or refusal to sit in the back of a bus. In the case of the Chicano Revolution, it was a Neil Simon play. In the winter of 1968, Wilson theater students had poured heart and soul into a production of the hugely popular Barefoot in the Park. At the final dress rehearsal, the school's much disliked principal, so conservative, remembered Lincoln High School teacher Sal Castro, that he wore suspenders and a belt to hold his pants up, hearing a line that he considered risque, raged at the students and forbade the play's performance. The next day, the cast and several hundred other kids, including 12 and 13-year-olds whose junior high shared the same campus, walked out of their first period classes. The principal immediately locked the gates and called the police. The supposed ringleaders were suspended. The walkout, although sparked by an unexpected provocation, was not entirely spontaneous. For weeks, small groups of students in all 4 of the East Side high schools, counseled by Sal Castro and a cadre of college students, had been laying the groundwork for a mass walkout at the beginning of spring. Castro, long active in liberal and Mexican-American causes, had carefully choreographed the protests to minimize harm to students while maximizing the political impact. He wanted school authorities to know about the walkout planning in the hope that the Board of Education might feel forced to negotiate with the community, making the actual protests unnecessary. In the event, Wilson had set the ball rolling, and the following week the other high schools would give it a hard kick. To understand why the blowouts, as they were soon called, were genesis events in the emergence of a new, militant Chicano identity, it's necessary to recall the immense frustrations that the world east of the LA River had experienced in its quests for political voice, equal employment, and successful education. Locked out. The first half of the 1960s were wilderness years for Los Angeles County's largest minority. Mexican Americans, a community that included descendants of native Californians and Californios, as well as 3 generations of immigrants from northern Mexico and the Southwest, especially Texas, had been marginalized in the period's big debates over reapportionment, fair housing, school integration, and police abuse. Without a seat on the city council since Gilbert Lindsay replaced Congress-bound Edward Roybal in 1962, they had no champion for the next 23 years to advocate for their interests in City Hall. Although Roybal had come within a few hundred votes of winning a seat on the County Board of Supervisors in 1958, 33 years would pass before Gloria Molina finally walked through the doors at the Hall of Administration. They were also locked out of the Board of Education, the hierarchy of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, the command structure of the LAPD, and the boards of major area universities and colleges. The Mexican-American situation in LA, at least in its political aspects, more closely resembled that of the disenfranchised black populations of southern cities than that of the black community a few miles away that had dramatically increased the number of its own elected officials since 1962. 3 factors conspired to deny Mexican Americans representation proportional to their population. First, as we saw in the first chapter's discussion of the unsuccessful campaign to incorporate the county island of East Los Angeles in 1960, political boundaries, sometimes drawn as deliberate gerrymanders, fragmented and diffused their voting power. Despite the fact, for instance, that the majority of Spanish-speaking people lived in contiguous districts east of the LA River, the community was divided into 3 parts and allocated to different assembly districts with Anglo majorities. Second, political unity was far more elusive on the east side than on the south side. Although black elected officials and their principal backers were divided by allegiances to the 2 warring camps within the state Democratic Party, Brown and Unruh, they shared a common civil rights program around which they easily combined forces. The East Side, in contrast, had a more significant Republican contingent, and, of course, a large share of non-citizens. Its religious culture was controlled by LA's reactionary Cardinal McIntyre, who, as we saw earlier, formed a triumvirate with Chief Parker and Mayor Yorty. On the whole, the Mexican-American middle class was more conservative and less activist than LA's black bourgeoisie. Moreover, Sam Yorty enjoyed authentic popularity on the East Side, a constituency that he cultivated intensely after his final break with black supporters in 1965. Third, liberal Democrats in City Hall and Sacramento were the worst sort of false friends, rhetorically championing Brown empowerment but tolerating rampant discrimination in government hiring, supporting urban renewal in East Side neighborhoods, and refusing to invest in Mexican-American election campaigns. When community-backed candidates ran against incumbent Anglo or Black Democrats, the party was consistently the defender of the status quo. This was the case, for instance, in a 1963 effort to reclaim Roybal's old council seat from Gilbert Lindsay, and also in a campaign to elect a Mexican-American to the school board in 1965. Likewise, in 1965, when the California Senate was reapportioned on a population basis, giving Los Angeles County 11 new seats, Democratic leaders ignored pleas to ensure that the boundaries of one of the new districts encompassed a majority of East Side voters. Statewide, the situation was little different. For instance, when the legendary Delano to Sacramento March of the United Farm Workers reached its destination in March 1966, Cesar Chavez requested a meeting with Governor Brown. Brown refused and left town for a golfing vacation in Palm Springs. El Macriado, the voice of the union, warned in response, "If you want to keep your job, Pat, you better not take us for granted. You better prove to us that you care about our problems. Because if we're going to have another 4 years with one enemy in Sacramento, we would rather have an honest enemy like Reagan. At least we would know where we stand." When aides urged Brown to make amends to Chavez and embrace greater representation for Mexican Americans, Brown ignored them. In November, he lost to Ronald Reagan. Also voted out of office was the sole Mexican-American member of the Assembly, leaving California, on the eve of the Reagan era, as the only state in the Southwest without a Spanish surname in its legislature. In contrast, Texas had 10, Arizona 4, Colorado 1, and New Mexico 33. Voter registration efforts, especially in Lindsay's 9th Council District, had faltered after the high point of the Viva Kennedy movement during the 1960 elections. The Community Service Organization, CSO, which had registered 15,000 new voters to help elect Roybal in 1948, abandoned such expensive efforts in 1960 to refocus on community self-improvement. By 1966, defunded by its adoptive parent, Saul Alinsky's Industrial Areas Foundation, it was shedding membership and struggling to survive on the dole of the Office of Economic Opportunity. It was also drifting rightward. Meanwhile, local chapters of the Leagues of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, the oldest, 1929, and most middle class of national Mexican-American organizations, were still great at hosting banquets, conducting award ceremonies, and raising scholarship monies, but not at generating mass activism. The same was true of the GI Forum, the veterans organization that had been such an important force in the desegregation of Texas and California schools in the early post-war period. The statewide Mexican-American Political Association, newly founded in 1960, had the goal of unifying voters around a common program, but it soon polarized internally between a camp led by veteran labor organizer Bert Corona that wanted to combine electoral mobilization with community organizing, and another camp led by Eduardo Quevedo, a Brown appointee, that envisioned MAPA primarily as a caucus within the party. In LA, MAPA became a significant force, but it would never be as dynamic or unifying as CSO had in its earlier days. Statewide, despite boasting many large and active chapters, it failed to leverage enough clout in Sacramento to make Brown act on its agenda. The only well-known Democrat to enthusiastically embrace La Causa, both in the fields and the cities, was Bobby Kennedy during the 1968 California primary. But he, of course, was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel just minutes after delivering his victory speech. Whose war on poverty? In July 1965, a month before the Watts Uprising, a new federal agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, was established by Section 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The commission was universally seen as a concession to the civil rights movement with a secondary mandate that vaguely addressed job discrimination against other minorities. Sex discrimination cases, however, went unheard for years. Symptomatic of their invisibility in the national debate, Mexican Americans, the second largest minority, were not represented on the commission. When a coalition of major Mexican American organizations protested this lack of voice, the new commission reluctantly agreed to hold a hearing on employment issues in the southwestern states, including California. But the March 1966 conference in Albuquerque barely lasted an hour. To add insult to injury, only one of the EEOC's 5 commissioners, a Wisconsin Republican, had bothered to show up, and he opened the conference with a warning that the commission would not be dictated to, and that it would only focus on individual cases, not purported patterns of economic discrimination against Mexican Americans as a group. Incensed, all 50 Mexican American delegates walked out. In a telegram to President Johnson, the group complained that our employment problems are severe and complex, yet we have no one on the commission with any insight into them. Dr. Miguel Montes, representing San Fernando's Latin American Civic Association, pointedly added, "I find it difficult to see how the commission can go out and enforce laws on fair employment when it practices discrimination itself against the Mexican Americans." A few months earlier, the Department of Commerce had released a report that underscored the economic crisis in Mexican American communities. Spurred by the Black economist Andrew Brimmer, a member of a task force that the White House had assembled to explore the causes of the Watts explosion, the department had conducted a special census of riot areas and minority neighborhoods in LA. It confirmed the earlier warnings from Paul Bullock and his fellow UCLA researchers that while the city's white labor force was thriving in a boom economy, working families in Black neighborhoods had lost ground in the first half of the 60s. Median family incomes on the South Side, for instance, had fallen from $5,100 in 1959 to $4,700 in 1965, a statistic widely cited in the national press. Less publicized, however, was the report's finding that family incomes in 3 predominantly Mexican American study areas, Boyle Heights, City Terrace, and East Los Angeles, had experienced a parallel erosion, from $5,513 to $5,106. Moreover, poverty and unemployment rates were similar in both communities, if slightly higher in South Central. In the abstract, the similarity of their economic plights should have predisposed the two communities to unite under a banner of jobs and equality, as they had at times in the 1940s. But local circumstances led instead to an embittered competition for war on poverty funds. The fires of August, of course, had made youth unemployment in South Central an urgent national issue, and the Black community, with its enhanced clout on the city council and in the legislature, buttressed by its growing alliance with liberal West Side whites, was incomparably better positioned to press the priority of its claims to federal aid. Moreover, there were few bridges between the communities. The Communist Party, once an important builder of interethnic unity, was still a presence in the Black community, but had long lost an active membership on the East Side. Of existing Mexican American organizations, only MAPA, which had participated in the 1963 United Civil Rights Committee campaign, advocated joining the emerging Black West Side alliance that would ultimately run Tom Bradley for mayor. Other sections of adult Mexican American leadership, especially the influential group of East Side businessmen and politicos close to Yorty, were as unsympathetic to Black power as white Republicans in the Valley. Although union activists sometimes worked together, especially in sectors like meatpacking that were organized by progressive unions, there were also serious frictions, most persistently in Local 300 of the laborers, a key construction union where Mexican Americans warily guarded their majority against any increase in Black membership. With most of the East Side workforce crowded into a handful of niches in construction, garment, furniture, brickmaking, and low-skill assembly work, it was feared that the easiest way for white politicians to create more employment for blacks was through displacing Mexican Americans. Outside forces, meanwhile, were working blatantly to inflame conflicts and sabotage potential black-brown unity. Mayor Yorty, unsurprisingly, was the prime culprit. As we saw earlier, he had sabotaged the war on poverty in Los Angeles by refusing to give elected community representatives a role in the administration of programs as required by the Maximum Feasible Participation Clause of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The major contested ground was the newly consolidated City/County Economic Youth Opportunity Agency, EYOA, where Yorty's intransigence had tied up millions of dollars of federal funding allocated for job training, youth employment, and summer schools in the crucial months before the August uprising. The mayor feared that power sharing with the community would enable the black ministers and politicians, organized as the Community Anti-Poverty Committee and led by Reverend Brookins and Tom Bradley, to build a competing patronage machine under the protection of the Johnson administration. Although eventually forced to give way on community representation, Yorty counterattacked the CAPC camp with appeals to the East Side's sense of grievance over perceived black control of local poverty programs. Tensions reached a climax in spring 1966 when Yorty attempted to purge Opal Jones, the dynamic welfare rights activist who directed one of the EYOA's major programs, the Neighborhood Adult Participation Project. NAP, which operated 13 neighborhood outposts, was originally funded by the OEO as an employment program, but under Jones's leadership, it refocused on movement-style community organizing, including voter registration, activities that Yorty perceived accurately as threats to his power. The executive director of the EYOA, Joe Maldonado, was a Yorty appointee, and he fired Jones after she refused to stop sending change agents, her term for locally recruited NAP workers, into the neighborhoods to listen to popular grievances and organize protests. The firing quickly backfired as hundreds of Jones's supporters rallied in front of the NAP headquarters at Wrigley Field, and the city's black elite bombarded the OEO's Washington headquarters with angry telegrams. The head of the OEO, Sergeant Shriver, who had come to despise Yorty, resolved the problem in a straightforward manner by separating NAP from the EYOA, making it an autonomous agency under the restored leadership of Jones. On the South Side, this was savored as a victory, but many on the East Side interpreted it as a further power grab by black leaders. There was no question that NAP's resources were skewed in a one-sided manner. Despite comparable populations and needs, only 3 of the 13 outposts were in Mexican-American majority districts. Jones, exulting in her new powers, unwisely provoked a confrontation in September when she fired Gabriel Yanez, the NAP director in Boyle Heights, who had become increasingly outspoken about his community's minority role in the poverty program. In solidarity with Yanez, Irene Tovar, his counterpart in Pacoima and a future leader of the Chicano moratorium, resigned her post. Tovar, collaborating with Rodolfo Rudy Acuña, a young professor at Pierce College in the Valley who would soon become the pioneer of Chicano studies at Valley State, campaigned for greater parity in NAP hiring and leadership. Although both were progressives and took pains to acknowledge the justice of black demands, other forces in the community, cheered on by Yorty, saw the conflict with Jones in strictly zero-sum terms. So did the media. One contemporary Times article was headlined, "Mexican Americans in LA called anti-Negro." Such rhetoric was damaging to both communities, especially at a time when Congress, faced with the rocketing costs of the war in Southeast Asia, was whittling away OEO funding. All the teen posts, for example, began closing at the end of 1966, and a dozen other programs were scheduled for extinction. Eventually, Ed Roybal, whose career had been launched by a coalition of blacks, Jews, and Mexican Americans, intervened. He set up a summit of sorts with Opal Jones that was also attended by Gus Hawkins, George Brown, a liberal congressman who represented a piece of the East Side, and Bert Corona, now the president of MAPA. They agreed to work together to increase funding for projects and staff in Mexican-American areas while fighting to keep the whole anti-poverty enterprise afloat. But amity at the top translated badly at the neighborhood level, where hiring parity was never achieved. Thus, for the next 5 years, interethnic tensions within the poverty programs remained at a boil, with episodic firings, walkouts, and unsuccessful attempts at peacemaking. Only Amigo Sam Yorty clearly benefited from black versus brown conflict, defeating Tom Bradley, who had been endorsed by Cesar Chavez in 1969, by a margin that has often been attributed to angry East Side voters. Failed schools. Schools were the eternal grievance for Mexican Americans. California, whose education code explicitly segregated Asian and Native American students, allowed local districts to categorize Spanish-speaking students with darker complexions as Indians and then force them to attend separate ramshackle schools. A 1928 Saturday Evening Post piece by best-selling novelist Kenneth Roberts exemplified the blithe bigotry that justified Mexican exclusion from white schools. In Los Angeles, one can see endless streets crowded with the shacks of illiterate, diseased, pauperized Mexicans, bringing countless numbers of American citizens into the world with the reckless prodigality of rabbits. When, after heroic campaigns by Mexican-American communities, courts finally prohibited local school districts from explicitly segregating their children, the result was seldom different from what followed the outlawing of racially restrictive residential covenants in 1948. Very little actually changed. If realtors and their political allies were the principal force maintaining a de facto color wall around the new suburbs, conservative school boards supported by white parents played a comparable role in the schools. Even where Mexican kids were allowed on campus, they were still segregated for the most part in vocational tracks and were rarely encouraged to go to college. Encompassing most of the largest urban Mexican-American community in the country, LA Unified School District, which included some satellite suburbs as well as the city of Los Angeles, was naturally the main battlefield. Ethno-racial isolation in schools had increased during the 1950s as the other traditional ethnic communities on the East Side, such as Jews and Japanese, moved to newer neighborhoods on the West Side. The all-white LA County Board of Education, meanwhile, focused most of its energies and resources on opening new schools in the Valley, rather than maintaining or upgrading older campuses in poor neighborhoods. The separate Catholic school system under Cardinal McIntyre was not an alternative for working-class families unable to afford the tuition, and its reputation for advancing Mexican Americans to college was little better than that of the public schools. One statistic, above all, summarized the school crisis. Half of Mexican American kids, especially those who were native-born, routinely failed to graduate from Los Angeles high schools. A 1965-66 survey found that Roosevelt and Garfield were the most extreme cases. At the latter, a 96% Mexican school, the dropout rate was almost 2/3. Board members and their spokespeople usually blamed parents for encouraging their kids to leave school to work. But as Ruben Salazar reported in the Times in 1962, the number of pupils asked or required to drop out exceeds the number voluntarily quitting, despite the fact that the school records themselves list only half of the total dropouts as being uneducable. This finding was confirmed by UCLA's Paul Bullock. The simple fact is that the Board of Education either does not know or does not publicize the real factors underlying the high dropout rates in many of the schools, particularly in minority group areas. Local school administrators unhesitatingly confirm that a significant proportion of the so-called dropouts are either encouraged or invited to leave school. As a result, the median educational level on the East Side was a mere 9 years, as contrasted with 11 in the black community. In the decade before the blowouts, Several major studies highlighted other structural causes of this educational catastrophe in Los Angeles and the rest of the Southwest. In addition to the attitude of principals and counselors with their sinister category of uneducable, the National Education Association emphasized the refusal of the schools to provide bilingual classes or even allow Spanish to be used on playgrounds for 1.75 million Mexican-American children. The NEA called Spanish-speaking children an alienated group, totally forgotten in the civil rights drive. Since Mexican migration to Los Angeles was rapidly increasing during the 1960s, the County Board of Education's prejudice against Spanish was taking an ever greater toll on East Side children. In the same vein, a report by the State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, based on 1967 research and hearings, expressed shock at the frequency with which Mexican-American students were put in classes for mentally retarded individuals simply because they cannot speak English. It also spotlighted the lack of Mexican-American teachers, as well as the large number of Anglo teachers and administrators who were rejected by other schools and dumped on the East Side. Additionally, UCLA's Mexican-American Study Project found that kids had weak incentives to graduate, since a high school diploma did not correlate with increased income. Graduates tended to end up in the same low-wage jobs as friends and siblings who dropped out. Clearly, discrimination in labor markets was part of the problem. Since the Korean War, a succession of groups had tried to address the schools crisis, most notably the Education Committee of the Council of Mexican-American Affairs, CMEA. In the mid-60s, it had been rejuvenated to some extent by a leadership of younger Mexican-American educators and professionals. The Times styled them as a corps of Pancho Villas to lead the Mexican-American out of his inferior role in California education. In fact, they were anything but revolutionaries. Indeed, Ralph Guzman, the assistant director of UCLA's Mexican-American Study Project, contrasted them to the old firebrands of the 1940s and 1950s. Many of the young people coming up have bypassed the old militant phase. You hear a different language being spoke now, less angry. They're talking politics now. They want to participate. Their mainstream ambitions, moreover, did not connect in any urgent or passionate way with the kids sitting in overcrowded classrooms listening to indifferent teachers droning on about the Pilgrims. The real Pancho Villas were teenagers, and their cradle, as Sal Castro called it, was a Jewish retreat on the Malibu coast. Camp Hess Kramer, opened in 1952, was the first Jewish summer camp west of the Mississippi. Its prime mover, Rabbi Alfred Wolf of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, had been a Zionist youth leader in Germany and brought to Los Angeles the Wandervogel ethos and love of nature that inspired German youth before the dark age of Hitler. In the 1960s, moreover, Wolf was the city's leading ecumenical figure and the chair of the short-lived Blue Ribbon Commission established to address the demands of the United Civil Rights Committee in 1963. Working with the LA County Commission on Human Relations, of which he became chair in 1965, Wolf made Camp Hess Kramer available for weekend conferences and retreats, the most notable of which was the annual Mexican-American Youth Leadership Conference. Sal Castro, who had long experience as a playground supervisor, volunteered to be one of the counselors at the first session in 1963. For most of the 150 or so students, nominated by teachers and principals as potential leaders, the conference was a unique experience. There were wall-to-wall Mexicans, Castro later recalled. Mexicans ran it, and Mexicans attended. Although the first conferences didn't stray far from usual boilerplate emphases on good citizenship and school achievement, Castro encouraged his students to voice complaints about school conditions and explore the history and meaning of their ethnicity. Gradually, the annual conversations became more radical, reflecting the impact of the Watts Uprising, the fight in the fields, and the rebellions on college campuses. Soon, some of the alumni, now in college, were returning as Camp Kramer counselors, while others were founding activist groups at East LA College, UCLA, Cal State LA, and elsewhere. Moreover, the kids getting off the buses after the long drive from the east side were a different breed as well, more defiant and ready to rebel. They also had started using an old slang term, not only as a synonym, but also as an alternative to Mexican American. They were beginning to call themselves Chicanas and Chicanos. In 1967, a many-faceted movement began to crystallize out of the Camp Kramer conferences, the trips to Delano, and the skirmishes with school administrators and cops. A striking innovation was the rise of an East Side underground press that included La Raza, edited by Eliezer Risco, and Inside East Side, edited by Raúl Ruiz and Victor Franco. The latter was specifically aimed at high school kids, with reporters on different campuses. La Raza was published at the historic Church of the Epiphany in Lincoln Heights, which had become and would remain for years the key movement center for the East Side. Its young Episcopalian pastor, Jean Luce, a veteran of civil rights struggles in East Harlem, kept its doors open to anyone who wanted to make change in the community, no matter how militant or radical. As Sal Castro recalled, Father Luce was a very valuable ally to us, especially since I found it difficult to get Catholic clergy to support our efforts. Because I wanted Mexican parents to think that the church was supportive, I once asked Father Luce if he didn't mind wearing his priestly collar at our meetings and demonstrations. "I need you to look like a Catholic priest," I told him. Father Luce took this well and complied. Luce also provided funds for a second movement center, La Piranha, at Olympic and Atlantic in unincorporated East LA. The organizers were a spin-off of the 1967 Camp Kramer Conference, calling themselves Young Citizens for Community Action. Like other East Side groups, young and old, they canvassed votes for Julian Nava, a graduate both of Roosevelt High and Harvard, who won a seat on the Board of Education in November, a victory finally made possible by a united front of community organizations. But it was their involvement in protesting several shocking cases of violence by the Sheriff's Department, including the killing of a 15-year-old boy and the beating of an entire family, that led the group to transform themselves into the Brown Berets, with Kramer alumni and former Yorty intern David Sanchez as Prime Minister. Inspired by both the Panthers and the iconography of the Mexican Revolution, the Berets cut a striking, audacious figure in the community, one that appealed to tough youth otherwise alienated from vote gathering and demonstrations. In contrast to the Panthers, however, whose Oakland leadership shared a substantial political education in Black nationalism and Third World socialism, the embryonic Chicano movement, including the Berets, did not yet have a clear political identity. As Raúl Ruiz remembers, "At our meetings at the Church of the Epiphany or at La Piranha, there was no discussion of history, of ideology, or of political theories. We talked about community issues, period. In time, the movement developed an ideology that came to be known as Chicanismo, or cultural nationalism, but not in the beginning. We were issue-oriented, and if anything was influencing us, it was a sense of pragmatism. Consciousness and ideology would be built on action rather than ideology creating action." Likewise, on local college campuses, Chicanos were forming groups and debating their identity and purpose. In the beginning, their major concerns were winning representation in student government, expanding recruitment of high school graduates, increasing financial aid for low-income students, ending white fraternities' common practice of racist caricatures, and including Mexican and Mexican-American history in the curriculum. The latter demand soon became a call for full-fledged Chicano studies departments, similar to what Black students were fighting for at San Francisco State and elsewhere. In May 1967, the Los Angeles City Human Relations Commission sponsored a Mexican-American collegiate conference at Loyola University that brought together almost 200 students from 14 campuses. The participants, including Roybal's daughters, Lillian and Lucille, voted to create the United Mexican-American Students, UMAS, as a regional, soon statewide, federation of campus chapters, with a coordinating centro chaired by Alberto Juarez, a former Kramer counselor and teen post director who had recently returned to East LA College. Over the next 8 months, active chapters were consolidated at Cal State LA, LA City College, and UCLA, with seedlings at Valley State, Occidental, Loyola, Long Beach State, and elsewhere. East LA College, which had the largest Mexican-American enrollment, already had a group called MASA, Mexican American Student Association, but its leadership resisted becoming UMAS, and then, in 1968, refused to support the blowouts. Juarez, Brown Beret Carlos Montes, and others punctually left and formed a more radical group that published the alternative campus paper La Vida Nueva. UMAS's campus organizers in this period were a galaxy of future community leaders and intellectuals: Vicky Castro, Carlos Munoz, Susan Racho, Carlos Vasquez, Moctezuma Esparza, Juan Gomez Quiñones, Ramsis Noriega, Phil Casturita, Maria Diaz, Gil Cardenas, Hank Lopez, and others. But in its early months, even as it was studying the examples of SDS and BSU, UMAS was still mostly moderate in its orientation and demands. This began to change at a statewide UMAS conference held at USC in mid-December, which included an electrifyingly radical contingent from the Bay Area dressed in paramilitary garb and quoting Malcolm X and Che. The Northerners emphasized the importance of forming alliances with blacks and working to aid struggles back in the barrios. 2 months later, the elders of the Movimiento, Corky Gonzalez, Bert Corona, and Reyes Tiarina, along with Teatro Campesinos' Luis Valdez, turned the heat up another notch at UCLA with an event organized by Student Council member Rosalio Munoz and UMAS. Buses brought kids from the East Side high schools, and the auditorium was packed. The speaker I remember the most, Munoz later told Mario Garcia, and the one who had the most impact on me was Reyes Lopez Tijerina, the militant and fiery leader of the land grant movement in New Mexico. I was particularly impressed because he spoke in Spanish. But it wasn't just his use of Spanish. It was his evangelical style of speaking. I learned later that he had been a Pentecostal preacher, and his speech showed that. It was incredible. No one welcomed this turn toward direct action more than Sal Castro. In the movement centers, Underground Papers, the Berets, UMAS, and the recent Camp Kramer graduates busy organizing on their high school campuses, he saw a full-scale orchestra ready to play an overture that would shake the walls at the Board of Education. With his confidential student planning group, Castro outlined a sophisticated plan. Each UMAS chapter would adopt a high school to support. The walkouts would be peaceful, but in the event of attacks by the LAPD or Sheriff's Department, the college students and berets would shield the kids, taking whatever blows were rained down. But in planning the walkouts, writes Castro, I kept to myself a deep, dark secret. Yes, I felt that something like the walkouts was needed to shake things up, and I was prepared to go through with it. But what I really wanted was to bluff the school board and school officials. I wanted to use the threat of a mass student civil disobedience as a way of forcing them to listen to the kids and to change their attitudes and practices about our students. I thought that a bluff would be sufficient to achieve our objectives. But I also did fear that if we carried out this protest, what might happen to the kids and their safety. In the back of my mind was the Watts riots and how the police and the military came down on blacks with unneeded force that killed and wounded a large number. The bluff was an understandable but unrealistic hope. In any event, the Wilson kids preempted the plan and unleashed a revolution. Walkout. The first week of the walkouts, March 4th to 8th, was clouded by the fear that Cesar Chavez was dying. The farm workers' leader, invoking the example of Gandhi, had started a hunger strike 3 weeks earlier, on February 13th. Despite 2.5 years of demonstrations and boycotts, the union had failed to bring the grape growers to the bargaining table, and continuous attacks on the picket lines by sheriffs and private guards had sapped morale. Many of the younger workers, disgruntled with nonviolence, wanted to fight back tit for tat. The hunger strike was thus aimed not at the growers, but at the union base, with the aim of reasserting Chavez's control over the union's direction and strike tactics. By the beginning of the third week, he was unable to walk unaided, and his doctors, who had warned against a water-only fast, began to fear for his life. Bobby Kennedy flew to Delano to give his support. Chavez would end the hunger strike on the 25th day, breaking Gandhi's record. In this generally tense atmosphere, Castro and his UMAS kitchen cabinet, as he called them, went into a frantic huddle on the weekend following Friday's protest at Wilson. The new plan called for a mass walkout on Wednesday, March 6th, with staggered starting times in order to maximize news coverage at each school. But Garfield in East Los Angeles jumped the gun, possibly at the instigation of the Berets, and an estimated 2,700 kids bolted classes on Tuesday afternoon. They gathered outside the school, where some of them were roughed up and several arrested by sheriffs. The big surprise, however, was a simultaneous noon walkout at almost all-black Jefferson High School just south of downtown, a campus known for its musical alumni, including a dozen of the country's most celebrated jazz musicians. The Jeff students, angry at the indifference of white administrators and teachers, the wretched quality of cafeteria food, and a bizarre dress code that banned afros, wanted immediate reforms, including a Black history curriculum and the replacement of the principal by a Black educator. Their boycott of classes, with considerable parental support, continued for a full week alongside the East Side high schools and illustrated the dual nature of the blowouts. On one hand, the official Chicano walkouts, involving an estimated 10,000 kids, coordinated by Castro's student organizers, and on the other, a series of spontaneous and parallel protests on Black and even majority white campuses that mobilized another 3,000 or so students. On Wednesday, the protests and news coverage finally conformed to plan, and thousands of students walked off all 4 East Side campuses. Chicano students at Belmont High, just west of downtown, were also supposed to participate, but their protest had to be postponed because its guardian angels, UMAS members at LA City College, were delayed in mobilizing. At Roosevelt, cops from nearby Hollenbeck Station declared a tactical alert and then aggressively cleared kids from the sidewalks with prods from their batons. A Free Press reporter observed one particular cop in action. After slamming one young Chicano up against the school fence, badge number 1191 politely told him, "Listen, fuck-ass, when I say move, get your ass out of here." The 250-plus-pound officer began seizing prettily dressed Roosevelt girl students who weighed less than 100 pounds and roughing them up. At Garfield, student protesters agreed to attend an assembly called by the principal, but warned they would again walk out if their demands were not taken seriously. As students began to fill the school bleachers, 4 sheriff's cars roared into the stadium, discharging helmeted officers with their batons unlimbered. The rally descended into chaos. Meanwhile, Castro was leading most of the Lincoln student body out the school's front door, along with a few sympathetic teachers. He was surprised that not only had senior high school students walked out, but also junior high school ones. I had targeted primarily the older kids for the demonstration, and not very much the younger ones. I didn't want to put these chavalitos in any jeopardy, but here they were on the sidewalks. As Castro and the Lincoln kids marched to a school district office in Hazard Park, the cops from the Lincoln Heights precinct, in contrast to their thuggish brothers from Hollenbeck, let the orderly crowd pass without interference. With Moctezuma Esparza as their spokesperson, they explained the reasons for the walkout to a skeptical administrator and promised a continuing boycott until the Board of Education agreed to meet with students and parents and hear their grievances. That evening, Castro, who wanted a brief intermission to analyze the day's events and organize more community support, including contact with Black schools, convinced kids to postpone the next walkout until Friday. However, Belmont, where frustration was high from missing the Wednesday protests, was given a green light to do their thing on Thursday. Carlos Munoz, then a graduate student and UMAS president at Cal State LA, was a Belmont alumni. In his oral history, he fondly recalled the cosmopolitan character of the campus. I was probably one of the very few UMAS leaders, if not the only one, that had not had a bad experience in high school as a Chicano. Belmont at that time was the only public high school that was integrated, almost completely, because it was the only school that was designated as being focused on foreign students. In other words, students coming from all over the world would get automatically placed there. The lunchtime walkout was also well integrated, with many white kids joining their Chicano schoolmates. The principal, an authoritarian ex-Navy captain opposed to mutinies of any kind, immediately ordered a campus lockdown, which prevented many of them from leaving campus. So instead, they roamed the halls chanting slogans until the LAPD appeared and started shoving and beating them with nightsticks. Raul Ruiz remembered the bold feat of one Anglo girl. As the cops were trying to prevent the students from leaving the school, she asked the police if she could borrow their bullhorn so that she could try to convince the kids to return to their classes. They agreed, but instead of doing what she said she would, she yelled into the bullhorn, "Walk out! Walk out!" She then ran away carrying the horn with the cops chasing her. The biggest and most surprising melee on Thursday, however, occurred at majority black Carver Junior High, a campus that would be the epicenter of a second wave of student revolt the following year. According to one of the teachers interviewed by the Times, students had arrived in class Thursday morning highly excited by reports of troubles the day before at nearby Jefferson High School and 3 Eastside high schools. They wanted to be involved too, she said. When the noon hour came, they dashed outdoors and immediately began ripping things up. Through the noon hour and afterward, a carnival atmosphere prevailed. Students did not appear angry. The principal, instead of calling in the riot squad as his counterparts had done at Belmont and Roosevelt, simply sent students home. Their frolic left a schoolyard full of debris, broken windows, the top half of the school flagpole bent at a right angle from the bottom, garbage strewn about, and burned bushes. Rain showers on Friday, March 8th, scarcely affected the enthusiasm of East Side students or their willingness to climb fences, pull down gates, or do whatever was necessary to leave campus. The Lincoln students, however, once again walked out the front door and trekked down to Hazard Park. Stung by media criticism for their rough methods at Roosevelt and Belmont, the LAPD accommodated the marchers, stopping traffic and even letting Castro ride to the park on the hood of a squad car. As the kids walked on the sidewalks, I passed by on the car with my dark glasses on, waving to the students who were shouting and happy. I felt like I was the Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade. Waiting at the park were Nava and Roybal, as well as a nervous white board member. This was the first time that most of the kids had seen their 2 elected representatives. Although they expressed sympathy for student grievances, even Roybal, who complimented the students for their discipline and nonviolence, was not yet ready to endorse the walkouts, although he promised to send a statement when he returned to Washington. He never did. Nava, for his part, promised he would try to prevent reprisals against walkout leaders, but he offered no encouragement that the board would accept the students' demand that it hold a meeting at Lincoln High to hear grievances. Superintendent Jack Crowther meanwhile told reporters that if kids wanted to talk to the board, they could come to its regular public meeting on Monday night. In so many words, the barrio's 2 ambassadors to the larger power structures had patted the students on the back and told them to go home. This disillusioning response, however, was balanced by exciting news of spontaneous support actions throughout the city, including a sit-in at Jefferson, a second walkout at Carver, and another on the west side at University High, where a new left group was organizing. In addition, at Belmont 6 girls were arrested, including 16-year-old Fran Spector, whose father, a local communist leader, had in the 1930s been sentenced to San Quentin for the crime of organizing a farm strike in the Imperial Valley. The pressure points on the board were rapidly multiplying, and no one could predict what would happen the following week. Although Castro was elated by the massive turnouts and the soaring spirits of the protesters, he was shocked by the lack of support from fellow teachers and the Catholic clergy. In preparing for the Wednesday blowout, he had met with representatives from the American Federation of Teachers to seek a pledge not to cross the student picket lines. But most union teachers on the East Side did, and some of them, including several outspoken Mexican Americans, became bitter public enemies of the emergent movement. At Belmont and Roosevelt, when the police entered school grounds to beat students, white teachers watched without protest. The situation was even worse at Jefferson, where teachers staged their own three-day walkout, demanding a crackdown on student organizers and restoration of the status quo ante, that is to say, the restoration of what kids had long referred to as the plantation. At stake was nothing less than white control of minority schools, classrooms, and even kids' self-image. The racism of many white teachers was vividly documented in a letter to La Raza that spring from a white teacher who had supported the walkouts. "I stopped using the cafeteria and teacher's lounge a long time ago. I don't want to listen to teachers discuss your children. I give up on these dumb Mexicans. Felipe is so dirty I can't stand him. These damn parents should go back to Mexico. These parents are as dumb as their kids. I went to Juan's house. What a smell. I've never seen such lazy children." The unsupportive, even hostile attitude of parish priests was more surprising, since everyone expected that at least a handful would rally to the side of the youth they knew so well. But that didn't happen. I had already attempted to get some of the Catholic pastors in East LA involved, but they avoided me, Castro recalled. I even told the students to see if the priests in their churches might support them, but they got nowhere. One kid, perhaps in frustration, went to his church and took the banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe from the church and used it in the march to Hazard Park. It was a great image to have and gave the kids a sense that Guadalupe was looking after them. However, when the student returned the banner, the priest had him arrested. The following year, Cardinal McIntyre's paternalistic attitude toward the East Side would be dramatically challenged by a new group called Católicos por la Raza. The churchman who did show up to support the movement was a physically imposing Armenian Baptist who had grown up in Tijuana, Reverend Vahak Martirosyan. He would soon be elected chair of the Educational Issues Coordinating Committee, EICC, a parent community support group organized in the second week of the walkouts as an interlocutor to the board and City Hall. Martirosyan was a powerful orator in the evangelical mode, and he had another ability that most of the organizers lacked. We began to realize that to communicate with parents, we needed Vahak, Ruiz said. He spoke Spanish better than any of us could. I couldn't speak worth a damn in those days, and especially in Spanish. Another ally, whose wholehearted public support was all the more dramatic given the silence of most liberal Democrats, was Bobby Kennedy. Flying out of LAX after attending a ceremony in Delano to mark the end of Chavez's hunger strike, he warmly welcomed a delegation of high school walkout leaders. He shook each of our hands, Paula Crisostomo from Lincoln remembers. He raised his fist and said, "Chicano power." After an hour-long conversation, Kennedy posed for a photograph with the protesters, which La Raza published with the caption, "Outside agitator?" The second week added parents to the ranks of protest. Several hundred of them showed up at a Board of Education meeting on Monday, March 11th. The most right-wing member of the board, Robert Chambers, was so unnerved by the boisterous crowd that he reportedly pulled a pistol out of his briefcase. Nothing happened, recalled Castro, and I guess Chambers put the gun away, but it showed me how much we had scared the shit out of the board. After 3 hours of listening to and arguing with the Eastsiders, the board majority gave ground on 2 demands. They agreed to meet students and community at Lincoln High sometime later in the month, and they agreed to amnesty for the thousands of ordinary protesters. But they rejected parents' pleas to remove police and sheriffs from campuses and release the students who had been arrested. This infuriated the students in the audience, and a beret took over the microphone, while other students, in an eloquent gesture, burned their student ID cards. the meeting broke up in confusion. Nonetheless, Castro felt that the two concessions were enough to declare victory and end the boycott. He wanted the UMAS and the high school organizers to start working out formal demands to present to the board at the Lincoln High meeting. EICC, meanwhile, would take the lead in unifying the community around the program. So the East Side kids returned to school, taking with them a proud understanding of their collective power. On Tuesday, moreover, the Jefferson boycott ended in an almost complete victory with the removal of the white principal and the appointment of a black replacement. But the energy released by the blowouts continued to roil other campuses. Kids at Edison, another South Side junior high, emulated Carver and walked out for a day after breaking windows and setting some fires. At Venice High on the West Side, a mixed group of activists, long skirmishing with the administration on free speech issues, led half of the mostly white student body out for 3 days, despite a crackdown by a helmeted, baton-swinging phalanx of cops. The principal suspended 40 students on March 14th for defying authority, although he himself was seemingly defying the board's promise of amnesty. Venice was the last blowout. According to Castro's scorecard, 20,000 students at 15 campuses had participated in protests during the 10 days that shook the LA County Board of Education. Together with the following year's wave of strikes on black high school and junior high school campuses, echoed by solidarity demonstrations at several West Side schools, LA became the uncontested national capital of the 1960s high school rebellion. 66 years in prison. The historical importance of the blowouts was immediately acknowledged. Shortly after the walkouts ended, Julian Nava told Superintendent Jack Crowther, "Jack, this BC and AD. The schools will not be the same hereafter." Crowther replied, "Yes, I know." A Times headline asked if the events weren't the start of a revolution. However, with the revolutionaries back in school, leadership of the campaign was passed to the EICC, the parent community support group that was now endorsed by MAPA and the East LA Democratic Club. As Vahak Martirosyan told the press, "Now it is up to the adults to take over. We are not going to let young people below the age of 18 to do the work that belongs to us." But the reality was somewhat different. In fact, Castro explains, the college kids proved to be the driving force behind the EICC, although they wisely allowed the others to assume more public leadership. Martirosyan, for example, became the nominal leader of the group and its principal spokesperson. Still, the college students, such as Juan Gomez Quinones, Carlos Vasquez, Jesus Trevino, and others, guided the EICC, since they attended all the meetings and had more critical perspective on the schools, in addition to being more politicized. Working with the high school walkout leaders, their immediate task was to formulate demands to present to the board at the Lincoln High meeting on March 26th. At the top of the eventual list were reduction in class size, bilingual/bicultural education, Latino administrators in Mexican-majority schools, Spanish language training for English monoglot teachers, more counselors, a new high school on the East Side to relieve overcrowding, the abolition of corporal punishment, an end to ethnically biased testing, and a curriculum that included Mexican-American history and folklore. But unlike parents and students in South Central, the EICC did not demand integration or busing to better schools. They wanted reforms in situ, under community control, with bilingual classes as the bottom line. Although the ACLU's integration lawsuit, which it will be recalled, arose out of an unsuccessful attempt by black students to attend Southgate High School across the tracks from Watts in 1963, had been revivified and now included Chicanos, it had little support on the east bank of the LA River. The 1,000-seat auditorium at Lincoln High could barely accommodate the huge community turnout on the 26th. Castro was elated by the size and solidarity of the crowd, as well as by the forceful presentations by Martirosyan, Gomez Quinones, and other EICC spokespeople. But the board, with its peerless record of stalling reform in minority schools, had not come to make a deal. Although its newly elected Black and Mexican-American members, James Jones and Julian Nava, were genuinely sympathetic, they still sang along with the rest of the board, whose familiar refrain was, "We agree with most of your demands, but we don't have the money to implement them." It was true that school districts all over California were being hit hard by Reagan's drastic budget cuts. He had beaten Pat Brown 2 years before on the promise to clean up the mess at Berkeley, and was now fulfilling his promise of reducing middle-class taxes by targeting schools of all kinds. But students knew that this excuse was disingenuous. Many of the demands, including ending corporal punishment, appointing more Chicano administrators, and transferring openly bigoted teachers, required only political will, not bigger budgets. Several hundred students, disgusted with the board's evasions, stood up and left the meeting. "We walked out because we were getting nowhere," one Garfield student leader told reporters. "We wanted to discuss issues, and they were not being discussed." He raised the threat of a new walkout. The EICC, however, was willing to test the board's promise of a negotiating process that included regular meetings with its Urban Affairs Committee and future community hearings. Castro, meanwhile, decided to step back from the limelight and let the community take charge of negotiations, through the EICC and the newly formed parents' councils. His recusal was admirable. Others would have capitalized on the celebrity to run for office or seek a higher position. But his leadership was sorely missed, since extracting reforms from the board was a grindingly slow effort, especially without representation on the city council and with only one, very moderate voice on the board. Moreover, the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, followed a month later by that of Bobby Kennedy, diverted the media's attention from East Side concerns as schools raced toward the summer break. On the other hand, it was an election year, and the blowouts became grist for the propaganda grindstone of the far right. Earlier in February, groups had spread a rumor that the board had secretly prepared a massive busing program, and that white children would soon be forced to go to ghetto schools and vice versa. The near hysteria among white parents, especially in Hollywood and the Valley, was cultivated by gun-toting board member Chambers, who introduced a resolution to immediately and completely discontinue consideration of busing children for integration. After the blowouts, other reactionary figures stepped in. California's ultra-conservative superintendent of education, Max Rafferty, who later moved to Alabama and became a leading campaigner for George Wallace, chastised the LAUSD leaders for their failure to punctually punish the thousands of students who had boycotted classes. "Under no circumstances is it ever justified for students to leave classes for any reason except illness," he declared. "This is the state law, and you must uphold it." And, most ominously, a grand jury went to work, secretly investigating the blowouts. The 1968 grand jury was an instrument of the outsized political ambitions of Evel Younger, LA's district attorney. Elected in 1964, and now setting his sights on the 1970 race for state attorney general, Younger was guaranteed a place in constitutional history by his attempts to carpet bomb campus protest and radical speech with felony indictments. During the protests following the killing of Leonard Deadweiler in 1966, for instance, he ordered the arrest of John Harris, the young black organizer for the local Progressive Labor Party, and charged him with violating California's notorious Criminal Syndicalism Act on the basis of some wording in a mimeographed flyer. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The year after the East Side walkouts, when BSU members were arrested at Valley State during an occupation of the administration building, he hit them with more than 1,000 felony counts of kidnapping and false imprisonment. The case that he brought against Castro and 12 other blowout leaders in late May, following an undercover investigation led by 3 agencies, was the most Kafkaesque of all. The East LA 13, as they were soon called, were charged with having conspired to commit misdemeanors, disturbing the peace, and disturbing a school that usually did not involve jail time. But since conspiracy was a felony, their maximum sentence, compounded on multiple counts, added up to a nightmarish 66 years in prison. In the civil disobedience section of its final report, the grand jury revealed the kind of fervid mindset exploited by Grand Inquisitors like Younger in pursuit of legal precedents that would felonize any campus protest. The concept of peaceful protest, wrote the jurors, has been discarded as an obsolete tool to be replaced by overt criminal behavior indiscriminately directed against both property and person. Within a relatively short span of time, acts of violence have increased both in frequency and magnitude as a result of concerted efforts which seek to effectively utilize the lever of mob action to attain desired goals. But what evidence of planned violence, other than that by the police and sheriffs, was attributable to the organizers of the walkouts? Younger's team later revealed that they had presented the jurors with two crucial examples of conspiracy. A cop's claim that he was threatened by a protester, and an anonymous bomb threat phoned into one high school. That was about it. Nava, at a reception for Cesar Chavez, had warned Castro of the impending arrests, but Castro had discounted the likelihood. He was arrested as he was preparing for Lincoln's senior prom. His fellow conspirators, several of whom were dragged out of their beds, included Eliezer Risco of La Raza, Carlos Munoz, Moctezuma Esparza, and David Sanchez of the Berets. Munoz was writing a paper for a graduate seminar on Marxism and had left a pile of books on the subject on his desk. The delighted officers thought they found unassailable proof of a communist conspiracy. Munoz was mortified. Several of the indictees were in Washington for the Poor People's March at the Capitol and had to be arrested by D.C. police. Younger, taking advantage of inflamed accounts in the media that equated the Berets with the Panthers, an exaggeration that the Berets themselves played up, had a subordinate tell the press that all the defendants, except possibly Castro and Risco, were Beret leaders. Later news accounts, however, hinted that Castro was a secret member, even the godfather of the Berets. Younger, of course, knew from his several undercover informants, as well as from police surveillance, that only 4 of the 13 were Berets. But he didn't let that fact stand in the way of the invaluable electoral propaganda manufactured from the case. He further bolstered the image of defendants as dangerous agitators by imposing a higher bail than normally would be applied to robbery or burglary cases. A judge quickly ruled the bail excessive and reduced it. Thanks in some measure to the publicity generated by these indictments, as well as 2 other mass felony cases in 1969 involving the BSU at Valley State and Brown Berets accused of disrupting a Reagan speech at the Biltmore Hotel, Younger took office as the state's hard-as-nails Attorney General in 1970. The governorship was his next ambition. All 13 defendants, meanwhile, had to live under the shadow of a prison sentence for the next 2 years until the indictments were finally thrown out by an appeals court. Castro's ordeal was unique. His was the Dreyfus case of the East Side. After his arrest, the board removed him from his classroom and eventually charged him with 46 counts of unprofessional conduct, mostly arising from his persistent insubordination. After several mass demonstrations and a week-long sit-in by parents, he was returned to Lincoln High, where 40 of his colleagues immediately protested his reinstatement by demanding transfers. Chambers, likewise, mobilized his right-wing base against Castro's return. And in a surreal episode, an elegantly dressed group of white women from the upscale suburb of Marina del Rey sat in at the board offices to demand a policy outlawing such sit-ins. 6 months later, Castro was again evicted from Lincoln and rotated through a series of white schools and non-teaching assignments. Community support remained strong. There were more picket lines, civil disobedience leading to the arrests of supporters like Father Luce, a walkout at one high school, and the resignation in protest by the board's Mexican-American Education Committee. At the beginning of the 1973-74 school year, he was finally reassigned to a majority Chicano high school, but Belmont rather than Lincoln. During his years in exile, Castro had received numerous job offers, especially from colleges searching for Latino administrators, but he never wavered from his original commitment to teach and inspire the next generation of La Raza. 23. The Children of Malcolm X, Black High School Activists, 1968 to 1969. The March 1968 East Side blowouts, as we have seen, were both preceded and accompanied by similar protests in South Central schools. From the fall of 1968 through the winter of 1969 to 1970, newly formed black student unions took the lead in a rolling series of protests that included the first and only student-led general strike in a major urban school district in the United States. Simultaneously, Chicano teenagers, now organizing in chapters of United Mexican American Students, continued their own actions but increasingly sought to synchronize their campaign with the more powerful and broadly supported BSU movement. In March 1969, Operational Unity, never formalized but effective nonetheless, emerged between 18 predominantly black junior and senior high schools, 4 or 5 majority Chicano schools, and a half dozen white or ethnically mixed high schools, as well as 3 junior colleges with significant minority enrollment. State college and university chapters of the BSU, UMAS, and SDS also provided significant support, as did the Black Congress, the Panthers, the Che Lumumba Club, the Brown Berets, and other radical groups. At the height of protest, 12,000 LAUSD students and perhaps 3,000 more junior college students were on strike against what they regarded as a racist, failed education system. A system, moreover, that answered community demands for change by calling the LAPD onto campuses to beat and arrest kids as young as 12. The resulting turmoil became the backdrop to the most racially charged mayoral election in LA history. The centrality of the BSUs in these events begs a brief examination of the larger national picture of student black power. The first wave of black student activism, of course, arose in traditional black colleges in border and deep South states in the early 1960s, and provided the cadre for the organizing campaigns of SNCC and CORE. The second wave, embracing different iterations of black consciousness, was national in scope and led to protests on some 200 campuses in 1968 and 1969. Its chief institutional expressions were the BSUs, or, on some eastern campuses, student Afro-American societies. Martha Biondi, in her history of the movement, writes, "These students constituted the first critical mass of African Americans to attend historically white universities. Deeply inspired by the autobiography of Malcolm X and the charismatic leadership of Stokely Carmichael, yet shaken by the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., they were engaged in a redefinition of the civil rights struggle at a time when cities were in flames, hundreds of thousands of young Americans were at war in Southeast Asia, and political assassination was commonplace." In this context, she concludes, student leaders were turning the slogan Black Power into a grassroots social movement. Unlike the first wave that recruited from campuses to launch and sustain struggles in Southern communities, the second wave was for the most part focused on the campus itself, where BSUs and similar groups fought for Black Studies programs, more Black faculty, scholarships and special programs to raise Black enrollment to levels proportional to population, and, especially on campuses with authoritarian administrations, for free speech and the democratization of campus life. The resistance to these demands, especially in the South, was often brutal, leading to the police murder of students at South Carolina State in Orangeburg, North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, Jackson State in Mississippi, and Southern University in New Orleans, with dozens of others wounded by police gunfire at Texas Southern in Houston. Outside the South, second-wave struggles grew to epic dimensions, especially in California, where the battle for black studies at San Francisco State, led in its early stages by 24-year-old former LA SNCC organizer Jimmy Garrett, produced the longest student strike of the era in the winter of 1968 to 69. Before it ended, another, more violent strike broke out on the UC Berkeley campus in January 1969, after the BSU joined with Chicano and Asian students to form a Third World Liberation Front to demand the establishment of an ethnic studies college on campus. Similar demands had been raised earlier at UC San Diego. Black enrollment in California's university and state college system was shockingly small. At San Jose State, for example, there were only 200 blacks out of a student population of 22,000, while Valley State in Northridge in 1967 had exactly 23 blacks and 7 Chicanos enrolled. In Los Angeles, the Black Student Alliance / BSU at Cal State LA was organized in 1967. BSA was envisioned by its founder, sociology professor Harry Truly, as the first step in building a regional alliance of BSUs. Active BSU chapters subsequently emerged at LA City College, UCLA, LA Southwest College, a new community college where the Che Lumumba Club played a leading role, Long Beach State, and especially at Valley State, later Cal State Northridge, where mass felony arrests produced a crisis. What made Los Angeles unique, however, was the commanding role of students in grades 7 to 12, usually organized in their own BSUs, in a sustained struggle for local control over education. Although the movement recalled, to a certain extent, the 1963 protests against the LA County Board of Education, it was much more massive, and it sought community control rather than integration. The ACLU's Crawford case had been reactivated, but would be delayed for years by the board's stalling tactics and stunning duplicity. The LA protests, while sharing most of the same complaints, unfolded in a dramatically different fashion than the famous New York school battles of the same period. In the latter metropolis, white teachers struck in 1968 against a newly elected community school board in a Black and Puerto Rican section of Brooklyn, while in Los Angeles, Black and brown students walked out in 1968 and 1969 to force concessions from conservative white teachers and administrators. In Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the community side was led by adult organizations. But in LA, students initiated and led the struggle with the support of parents and adult civil rights groups, reversing also the pattern of leadership in the earlier UCRC campaign. Political scientist Jean Theo Harris, in an important article on the March 1968 blowouts, has criticized the literature on community control movements for leaving out the ways young people also spearheaded these efforts. Moreover, in the specific LA case, while the walkouts are considered seminal in Chicano history as a founding moment of Chicano power, they have been all but ignored by scholars of African American history, even by those studying LA's Black community. In fact, the 7th to 12th grade and junior college protests were arguably the most original and populist social movement of the entire decade in Southern California, especially when considered in their full multi-ethnic spectrum. The March 1968 blowouts, the mass arrests of BSU members and white supporters at Valley State, and the murder of Panther leaders at a UCLA BSU meeting all receive intensive treatment elsewhere in this book. So this chapter will focus on 3 important but forgotten protests: Manual Arts High School in fall 1967, Fremont High School in fall 1968, and the police invasion of Carver Junior High School in March 1969 that led to the general walkout in Black schools. Toilers Arise. The city's 3rd oldest high school, Manual Arts High, MAHS, at 41st and Vermont, was opened in 1910 as part of a campaign to industrialize Los Angeles. Focused on vocational training, particularly in the metal trades, its tough working-class student body, like the cast in some proletarian novel, were officially called the Toilers. One of its early graduates was a deeply estranged Sicilian immigrant named Frank Capra, whose idol and friend was a daredevil brawler, Jimmy Doolittle. The former would become Hollywood's chief mythologist of small-town America, while the latter would bomb Tokyo and then command the 8th Army Air Force in Europe. Later, MAHS would earn a footnote in the history of modern art for expelling Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston, the foremost pioneers of abstract expressionism, after they circulated a vaguely communistic broadsheet urging students to awake and use your strength. MAHS began to slowly integrate in the 1930s, and after the war there was rioting between black and white teenagers in the neighborhood around the school. When bigoted director Frank Capra went back to his alma mater for the 1950 commencement, he felt scared to death to look into the faces of so many black people. By 1967, the now almost entirely black school had seen years of underfunding, neglect, and squalor. Parents were alarmed by the poor quality of instruction, draconian school discipline, overcrowding, 3,700 students, filthy corridors and classrooms, and a shocking dropout rate. Like LA's other predominantly black and Chicano high schools, its teaching staff was full of deadwood, alienated and incompetent whites serving out their time with little affinity for students or their families. The tipping point came in June 1967, when a white English teacher flunked, and therefore prevented from graduating, a girl with an otherwise good academic record. NAACP leader Celis King III attempted to negotiate with white principal Robert Dehaney, explaining that the student's family had been the victims of a cross burning. His plea was summarily rebuked. The next group of visitors included US co-founder Tommy Jaquette and 3 brawny members of the Community Alert Patrol. Making their way past security guards, they stormed into Principal Dehaney's office and warned him that Angela Bates would graduate no matter what. "We don't give a damn what you or the school board say. If you want trouble, you can have it." For King, Jaquette, many other community leaders, and most of the black parents, the Bates' case condensed years of grievances against the school's administration and its majority white teachers. Eventually, the school board, unnerved by rumors of a possible riot, gave in and allowed her to graduate with her class. Far from reducing tensions, however, this initial victory for the community merely set the stage for a much larger confrontation over Dehaney. Transferred a year earlier from the Valley, Dehaney began the new school term in September by taking disciplinary action against students without notifying their parents. To the outrage of the student body, moreover, he locked bathrooms because he claimed they were being used for smoking marijuana. He also inexplicably refused to allow Manual Arts PTA to meet in the evening or hold fundraisers. When students attempted to organize an Afro-American study group, he kicked it off campus. Likewise, he permitted an English instructor to accept a book report on Hitler's Mein Kampf, while refusing to allow one on Malcolm X's Report to the Grassroots. The girls' vice principal, also white, was equally resented for her authoritarianism and aloofness, as well as her opposition to holding school dances. Both parents and students were primed to revolt. One group protested that Dehaney was insensitive, inhuman, incompetent, and hates children. The coalition demanding Dehaney's removal was remarkably broad, including the NAACP, the Black Congress organizations, US, CORE, the Panthers, Operation Bootstrap, CAP, and so on, and the United Parents Council, led by the fiery Margaret Wright. In addition, the campaign was endorsed by Congressman Gus Hawkins, Assemblyman Bill Green, School Board member James Jones, and normally conservative Police Commissioner Elbert Hudson. Boycotts and pickets were organized, and Margaret Wright, who would be involved in educational activism for decades, was arrested for the first time. Many of MAHS's white teachers, like their counterparts in New York City and elsewhere, were shocked that black power groups, or black community groups per se, were now claiming a right to intervene in school governance. If the community succeeded in getting rid of Dehaney, they reasoned, then some of them might be the next target. Many teachers were particularly outraged when Walter Bremond argued for the inclusion of Black history in the curriculum. "You want us to invent a mythology for you?" asked one irate teacher. Another demanded to know, "What about other minorities? Do we teach Chinese and Japanese history too?" And a white male teacher sighed, "When this thing is over, we'll have to put more emphasis on achievements by Negroes, like Nancy Wilson, who, I think, is some kind of actress." According to the editor of the 1968 MAHS yearbook, The Artisan, the faculty took matters into its own hands, and instead of reporting to school on Monday, October 21st, went to the school board to demand the immediate attention of the board to Manuel's problems and an injunction against those who disrupted school procedure. Both were promised by the board, so the faculty returned to school. The injunction was granted by the Los Angeles Superior Court, and a task force was sent to Manuel by the board to investigate the problems, of which all complained. The vice principal was removed, and eventually so was Dehaney, only to be replaced by another white principal. As always, the board continued its studies of conditions with little actual remediation. Tensions were still high at Manual Arts when the Western Regional Black Youth Conference, welcomed by Ron Karenga and the Black Congress, opened at the historic Second Baptist Church on Thanksgiving Day. The conference call announced, "We must begin to institute programs that speak to the needs of Afro-Americans and not programs that are a reaction to white definitions." The event was memorable for two reasons. First, it was an initial opportunity for BSU organizers and potential members from Northern and Southern California to compare experiences and strike up friendships. Second, it inaugurated a movement to boycott the 1968 Mexico City Olympics unless three demands were met. 1. The restoration of Muhammad Ali's boxing title, taken away after his refusal to fight in Vietnam. 2. The exclusion of South Africa and Rhodesia from the Games. And 3. The firing of Avery Brundage, the notoriously racist president of the International Olympic Committee. The Olympic Project for Human Rights was the brainchild of one of the most compelling figures in the Black Power movement, Dr. Harry Edwards, a sociologist from San Jose State who had been a national champion discus thrower. Edwards told an audience that included a half-dozen world-class athletes, Tommy Smith and Lou Alcindor among others, "It's time for Black people to stand up as men and women and refuse to be utilized as performing animals for a little extra dog food. We want to show the world that the United States is just as racist as South Africa ever hoped to be." As a result of this electrifying meeting, the Black student movement met the new year with tremendous self-confidence. The Puddle at Fremont. Fremont High School at 76th Street and San Pedro was built in 1924 and remained predominantly white until the mid-1950s, when Black families began to move into surrounding neighborhoods in large numbers. After the school board liberalized its transfer policies in 1964, ostensibly for the purpose of racial balance, the final contingent of white students bolted to Southgate High, and by 1968, Fremont was 95% Black. Like the other South LA schools abandoned by the white working class, its once stately red brick campus suffered physical and educational neglect. Fred Hoffman, the Freep reporter who covered the December 1968 protests, was astounded by the difficulty of simply entering the campus. On rainy days, the sidewalks around the school vanish under an enormous lake. The administration, he wrote, had found enough money to build a fence around the faculty parking lot, but no money could be found to deal with the drainage problem in front of the school. For students and parents, the giant puddle was a seasonal reminder that they did not live on the West Side. As at Manual Arts, the school's troubles coalesced around the figure of its white principal, Robert Malcolm, and an aging crew of white teachers, some of whom disdained even to go through the motions of teaching their oversized classes. As dropout rates soared and parental demands for reform increased, Malcolm sought to bridge the racial gap by sending a half-dozen Fremont students to attend Chatsworth High School for a week, staying over with local families. The stunt was designed to help improve relations between Negroes and Caucasians without the cost and controversy of busing. Chatsworth's principal, Gertrude Smith, an outspoken opponent of busing, called it a darn good plan where Negro youngsters who live in the ghetto area can find out that white kids are really decent kids and not full of hate. Regaling a handful of kids with the splendor of a modern white suburban high school, and then sending them back to their disheveled and overcrowded classrooms was a cruel joke that only rubbed salt into the wounds of the Fremont community. The uprising began over the simple right to be heard. Unlike at Manual Arts, where adult leadership defined the issues, Fremont's newly formed BSU chapter was Principal Malcolm's primary interlocutor, and then opponent. On the night of Monday, December 9th, students unsuccessfully attempted to discuss their grievances with the teaching staff at an after-school meeting of the school's Human Relations Council. The next afternoon, they made a second attempt. With 200 students waiting outside, 4 BSU leaders entered a faculty meeting called by Malcolm. Most of the teachers refused to hear them out and left. Several dozen, however, stayed to talk with the BSU. As the president of the Faculty Association, Gail Van Meter later told reporters, "The kids just wanted to attend the faculty meeting. They wanted to have the faculty listen to them. Their chief complaint," she said, "was the number of bad and racist teachers. And it is true, we do have some. They do not arrive for class on time, they allow students to go early, and they do not teach during class." Malcolm, refusing to concede any legitimacy to the BSU, immediately suspended the 4 leaders and gave a lurid account of the event to the Herald-Examiner, whose headline read, "High School Invasion," as if the students were outsiders or aliens. The next morning, 1,000 students boycotted classes and gathered in front of the school to debate what to do about the suspensions. While the rally was taking place, a small group lowered and burnt the U.S. and California flags and raised a makeshift BSU standard. A few stones were thrown. The administration panicked and called in the LAPD, which declared a tactical alert around the school. Hundreds more students left their classrooms, and the crowd moved to the athletic field. As the emotional temperature soared dangerously, a vice principal announced that Malcolm had lifted the suspensions. The crowd broke up, and most students returned to their last class. However, the next morning, students discovered that the suspensions had been lifted only conditionally. The BSU decided to rally students for a strike. Fred Hoffman described in The Freep what happened next. Most of the students were in the auditorium when police and security guards came in, guns drawn, and arrested 3 students. The kids went wild, and a crowd rushed to the principal's office in protest. Charles Hawkins, a Board of Education security agent who had taken part in the auditorium arrest, tried to push students away from the door of the principal's office. Someone threw a pop bottle, and it smashed on the wall near his head, the shattered glass gashing Hawkins across the face. The guard was given first aid treatment in the principal's office, while police, again on tactical alert, moved in on the students. Shouting, "The pigs are coming!" The students fled. The following morning, the BSU boycotted classes and announced a noon rally to discuss how to get rid of Mr. Malcolm. The principal had invited concerned members of the community to his office to discuss a resolution to the crisis. When a college BSU member showed up, he was promptly arrested. And as students flooded into the streets in protest, Malcolm closed the school. Meanwhile, BSU students at Jordan High attempted to hold their own rally, both to support the Fremont students and to address their own identical issues of poor instruction and a catastrophic dropout rate. But Jordan was sealed off by its black principal, Lionel Joubert, who mobilized varsity athletes to eject BSU members. He refused to negotiate with the group and expelled its officers. At Crenshaw High, meanwhile, 300 students rallied, taking down the American flag and burning it. Margaret Wright, of the newly formed Community Black Board of Education, told a Saturday meeting of students and parents from Fremont and Jordan that to burn a flag is a disgrace to most Americans, but they do not think it a disgrace to burn people. There are many black youth who will not pledge allegiance to the flag. They do not feel they have an allegiance to the flag, and after all, the pledge is a lie. If it said, "One nation divisible with liberty and justice for some," maybe they would say the pledge. On Monday, the LA County Board of Education, fearful of a chain reaction on inner-city campuses, and knowing that many teachers were afraid to come to campus, closed Fremont and transferred Malcolm. That evening, at a board meeting called to discuss the urgent need for more school revenue to address the problems of minority campuses, a contingent of parents from the East Side made sure that the members understood there would be more trouble if renovation of Lincoln High School wasn't at the top of the list. When the board agenda turned toward the crisis at Fremont, the school's BSU president, Ricky Ivey, demanded that the next principal be picked through a governing board made up of parents, students, and faculty. The students and parents were sponsoring the candidacy of a popular black vice principal, but the board had already decided to replace Malcolm with Donald Bolton, a respected black administrator. They thus refused to concede a governing board or anything remotely resembling community control. Although no one had particular objections to Bolton, the BSU, acting with considerable political sophistication, refused to back down from their stand on joint governance. Ivey told board officials that the selection of a popular black principal wasn't enough. "It doesn't make any difference. You picked him." He also reiterated the students' central demand for a review of teachers popularly held to be racist or incompetent. The group's faculty advisor, Coach Virgil Grant, warned the board, "We want control of our schools. Until this happens, Fremont will continue to be in turmoil." When the vast majority of the student body followed the BSU's lead and boycotted a school assembly to introduce Bolton, he responded patiently that he understood their point of view and agreed that the board was evading the question of consultation. He also reassured the BSU and concerned parents that he, on the other hand, was completely sympathetic to the larger movement for community control of schools. Having made their point, the BSU soon accepted that Bolton's appointment was at least a partial victory. The Times, beginning to show signs of a liberal turn in editorial policy, also got the big picture. The eruption of student unrest at predominantly Negro Fremont High School 3 weeks ago, it reported, signaled the arrival of local control of schools as a live issue in Los Angeles, which it called the first step in black people determining the way their children are educated in the city school boards or councils. They want power sharing with community boards or councils. The paper described the common feeling. The schools couldn't get any worse than they are now. The high dropout rate, the lack of skills in basic subjects like reading, and the low level of self-image and personal aspirations are facets of school life. Indeed, the paper concluded, failure of schools in minority areas is no longer challenged by most members of the Board of Education and top school administrators. BSU on strike. The return to school in January opened a new period of turmoil. 286 Valley State students were arrested on January 9th during a peaceful rally to support BSU members previously charged with felonies for the occupation of the administration building. A week later, Panther leaders Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were murdered on the UCLA campus by US members in a struggle over control of a proposed Black Studies program. Sheriffs, meanwhile, occupied East LA College for several days after a confrontation with the BSU chapter led by Melvin X. Yet the BSU agenda was making real gains. A black principal at Fremont, Black Studies at UCLA, and grudgingly at East LA College, and most spectacularly, the agreement of the Valley State Administration in mid-January to the creation of full-fledged Black and Chicano Studies departments. BSU members and their supporters there, however, still faced trial and possible imprisonment. These precedents made it more difficult for hardline administrators in LAUSD and the junior colleges to deny legitimacy to BSU and Chicano demands, even when students raised the most subversive of issues: funding for new programs, campus renovation, and the hiring of superior teachers. The battle over the quality of inner-city schools, moreover, directly challenged the policy of fiscal retrenchment in education that was a hallmark of the Reagan administration in Sacramento and its conservative supporters in local school districts. The pivot of the struggle in Los Angeles shifted in early 1969 to the unique alliance that had been formed the previous fall between the BSUs at Southwest College and Carver Junior High School. Southwest was the fruit of a generation-long battle led by Odessa Cox and her South Central Junior College Committee to open a college in and for the Black community. Carless students in Watts and Willowbrook had been forced for years to spend 2 hours each way riding trolleys or buses to reach LACC, a negative inducement to higher education. A site for the new school was purchased in 1950 at the intersection of Western Avenue and Imperial Highway. But 17 years passed before the benignly neglectful Board of Education allocated any funds for construction. Thanks to the Watts Rebellion, $2 million was finally appropriated, and the college opened in a dozen temporary bungalows in fall of 1967. Over the next 2 years, the student body expanded from 600 to more than 2,000. But Southwest remained more of a campsite than a proper campus, with the Board of Education claiming that it lacked funds for the next stage of construction. When West LA College opened a year and a half later, however, Southwest students were able to contrast their overcrowded conditions with the idyllic, new, almost entirely white campus. General dissatisfaction was quickly turned into active discontent with the formation of a large BSU chapter, whose most dynamic components were members of the Che Lumumba Club, led by Kendra Alexander. Other Black Power groups were also represented, but the young communist had the strategic clarity to understand how Southwest could become a cadre engine for struggles at all levels of LAUSD. Carver High School, the first school in LA to be named, or rather renamed, after a major Black historical figure, was more than 70 blocks north of Southwest, in the Central Avenue community that had been the central business district of Black Los Angeles from the late 1930s until the early 1960s. But many Southwest students lived in the area and had younger siblings or cousins enrolled there. Joseph Jones, a skilled organizer and effective speaker, became Southwest's emissary to Carver, assisting with the organization of its BSU and sometimes acting as an interlocutor with the principal. The Southwest Carver Coalition, he later told the press, is interesting because it is the first time schools at different levels have moved together on demands. Jones was particularly impressed with 15-year-old Ricky Ivey, the mature and charismatic president of the Fremont BSU, whom administrators would soon grow to dread. In a surprising reversal of seniority, the college students would call first upon Ivey and his kids to support their strike at Southwest. In January, after talks over a Black Studies department broke down, Southwest's president, John Grasham, had student negotiators arrested. The BSU organized a strike, and the campus soon became a war zone, with several bomb explosions, widespread vandalism, and more arrests. Later, at the trial of 16 BSU and student government leaders, the prosecutor would begin his case by saying, "Here is Southwest College, a school that is really nothing but bungalows. It was put there for lower-class people who can't go anywhere else. Most of the students don't know what they're doing. Most of the students are Negro or Black." As the Carver BSU members got caught up in the excitement of the Southwest strike and the never-ending round of meetings and events organized by other BSUs, they decided to become more confrontational in their own demands for Black studies and school improvements. At the end of February, their white principal cracked. Bawling like a baby, he fled the campus. The next day, the acting principal suspended the BSU and students walked out. A new principal, Andrew W. Anderson, was parachuted into Carver from the Valley, purely on the basis of his seniority, without any effort to find a black candidate of the caliber of Bolton at Fremont. Although Anderson rescinded the BSU suspension, that did little to relieve the suspicion that tough disciplinary action was coming. At the beginning of March, the Carver students asked Jones to mediate with Anderson. The two argued for an hour and a half without any result. The LAPD began spreading a rumor that Carver was high on the militant target list for changing from white to black principals. On Thursday, March 8th, 500 Carver students walked out of class to attend a BSU rally in support of the Southwest strike. There was an informal rally the next morning as well, and Anderson suspended a BSU leader named Teddy Gibson. The kids immediately phoned Jones and asked him to again intercede with the principal. He arrived at the school at 9 a.m., where he was arrested and handcuffed by campus security and held in Anderson's office for the LAPD. Some 200 kids, many wearing the fatigue jackets favored by BSUs, crowded into the administration building. Anderson told them they could sit in the hall if they refrained from disruption. A little later, without any warning, more than a dozen Metro Squad cops burst through a door, panicking the students, who fell over one another trying to escape. Gwen Scott, a field director for the teachers' organization, later said, "Many fell down, and I did too. Policemen had their clubs up and were saying, 'Move, move.' Many were jabbed with riot batons, and some were hit over the head. 5 students were hospitalized, including a 12-year-old girl, and a half dozen were arrested. A rumor spread like wildfire through the city that one girl had been killed." The following Sunday afternoon, 500 or more students, parents, and college BSU members gathered in South Park to discuss what to do. Dadani, chairman of the BSU at Southwest, said, "Schools must close Monday because we must move to give power to the students and to the black people so they can control their own community." A large group of parents endorsed the strike and volunteered to accompany students to meet with principals. "The quality of education," one father pointed out, "is so low that students are not being educated anyway." A delegation then went off to South Park, where Tom Bradley was holding an election rally. With the stridently racist campaign of Yorty chipping away at his white support, Bradley angered BSU members by refusing to endorse the demand to keep cops, particularly Metro Squad, off campus. In the weeks ahead, he would be unable to surmount the increasing polarization between middle-of-the-road white voters and insurgent black and brown youth. The school week started with a police tactical alert. From Watts to the Crenshaw district, reported the Times, junior and senior high schools were hit Monday with fires, vandalism, walkouts, picketing, rock throwing, and windbreaking. In sympathy, and obviously close coordination, demonstrations also burst forth at junior colleges as far away as Santa Monica. All 18 black junior and senior high schools were on strike, and the Board of Education closed Carver and Manual Arts for 2 days. At Fremont High School, gasoline was poured in the auditorium and set afire. At Crenshaw, creative strikers soldered the locks of classroom doors. Almost all of the student bodies at Washington and Jefferson were out on the sidewalks picketing and chanting. Meanwhile, at battle-scarred Southwest, most of the faculty threw in the towel. 47 out of 60 requested immediate transfers. On Tuesday, the strike spread across the city, and white and Chicano students became involved. At East LA College, UMAS organized a rally calling for the creation of a black-brown-white coalition against the use of police force on school campuses. At LA City College, the BSU/BSA, assisted by UMAS, SDS, and a contingent of anti-war veterans, began building barricades in anticipation of a total shutdown on Wednesday. The college's student council, meanwhile, voted to divert all of its remaining budget to a bail fund. The LAPD was quickly called in, as they were at Manual Arts, Crenshaw, Dorsey, Locke, and San Fernando high schools. Fires were reported at Berendo Junior High, Los Angeles High, and Taft High in the Valley. while at Maclay Junior High in Pacoima, there was a melee between white and black students. Scores of BSU/BSA members moved between campuses, offering support and advising younger students. Parents also mobilized, and that evening at Carver, 700 of them crowded into the auditorium to denounce Friday's police attack and unanimously vote in support of the strike. Wednesday saw a 9-division LAPD tactical alert, the largest since August 1965. The LAFD was almost as busy, with 65 reported campus fires. Forshey and Washington Irving Junior Highs went out, and there was a disturbance at Grape Street Elementary in Watts. At the new campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills, the faculty, in marked contrast to their colleagues at Southwest, voted to support the strike and assist the development of a Black Studies program on campus. But Wednesday's storm center was the strike at LA City College, where a confrontation occurred between BSU supporters and a student group known as the Victory in Vietnam Association. Viva had originated at UCLA, cheered on by the National Review's Russell Kirk and local right-wing television commentators George Putnam and Robert Dornan. Historian Bruce Franklin, in his book on the MIA movement, describes the group's sponsorship. On March 9, 1967, the Victory in Vietnam Association received a state charter from California as an educational institution. And less than 2 months later, the IRS granted it tax-exempt status as a charitable and educational organization. Viva was now able to hold the first of its lucrative annual Salute to the Armed Forces formal dinner dances, organized by its Ladies' Auxiliary, made up of wives of wealthy business, military, political leaders, which allowed the guests, including Barry Goldwater, Alexander Haig, H. Ross Perot, Bob Hope, Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty, and California Governor Ronald Reagan, to receive tax deductions for their contributions. With brimming coffers, Viva expanded rapidly and planned ever more ambitious campaigns to thwart the anti-war movement. Viva thought it could provoke a violent reaction from the BSU by removing some of the barricades in front of the college, while 30 cops waited across the street to intervene. But the strikers ignored the bait. The Viva men, all white, many of them big and husky, and most of them short-haired, advanced on a striker's barricade at the cafeteria. One of the strikers turned to a reporter and said, "If these freaks want to appease their egos, let them go ahead." The Viva members then furiously dismantled the cafeteria barricade, then moved to the main entrance where the barricading tables lay. The anti-strike group grabbed the tables and started hurling the barricade apart with violent force, bending umbrellas, hurling chairs into Vermont Avenue. For so heroically destroying college property, something that the strikers had carefully refrained from doing, Steve Frank, the leader of LACC Viva, received a letter of commendation from President Nixon and briefly became a right-wing media star. The BSU later presented its own award to Frank when a member punched him in the jaw. On Wednesday evening, a striking student was murdered. The setting was ordinary. A group of Washington High students went to Pepperdine College to play basketball in the college gym, as they had many times before. Pepperdine, whose founder had made a fortune in the auto parts business, was a conservative Christian school whose campus at 79th and Vermont was originally surrounded by neighborhoods full of fundamentalist whites from southwestern states. After the 1965 rebellion, Pepperdine's board decided to relocate the college far away from the inner city. Malibu was the ultimate choice, and in the interim, they added security to protect its majority white student body. 15-year-old Larry Kimmons, noted for his mild manner, was one of the kids from Washington, and he and his friends, finding the gym locked, were leaving campus when a security guard stopped them. He tried to handcuff Kimmons, but the agile youngster broke free. The guard, inexplicably it seemed to the others, blasted him with a shotgun. Many were convinced the school would burn, but behind-the-doors negotiations between Pepperdine's president and community leaders lowered the temperature. In November, After a travesty of a manslaughter trial, the guard was sentenced to probation without jail time and ordered to pay a $500 fine. Such was the value set on Kimmons's life. By the end of the week, though the walkout remained almost total at Carver and Jefferson, elsewhere students were trickling back to classes. The BSU/BSA leadership began to debate an exit strategy. According to Lil Joe Johnson, a Compton-based activist whose erudition impressed everyone who met him, the most compelling argument was made by Franklin Alexander. Che Lumumba's organizers at Southwest were experienced, disciplined, and smart strategists, Johnson later said. As the student strike approached its climax, Franklin recognized that the strikes were nearing a transitional stage where they would either peter out with a whimper or set up for a bang by the police. In either case, it would be designated a failure by the media. So Alexander argued at a community/student meeting that the protesters must take the moment in their own hands by culminating the strike of their own accord. There was also a desire to declare victory before us and the Panthers renewed open warfare. Outside a BSU meeting at Victory Baptist Church on Friday night, 4 US members shot 24-year-old Ronald Freeman, a leading Panther. He was badly wounded but survived, thanks, he claimed, to the little red book in his pocket that stopped one of the bullets. According to Lil Joe, this hugely increased the popularity of Mao's volume of aphorisms. At the same time, the right was furious over school administrators' inability to repress the BSUs and restore order to their campuses. A combined LAPD/DA task force was set up to marshal evidence that the strike was a carefully planned criminal conspiracy. Addressing the City Council on Friday, March 14th, Chief Redden made the bizarre charge that funds are being channeled into the disruptive elements in Los Angeles through the Chinese Communists, the National Council of Churches sources, and others. He also revealed that Dorothy Healy, the Red Nemesis, had been seen at a BSU meeting the previous Tuesday, agitating for a march on City Hall. Interviewed by the press, Healy just chuckled. "That's good news. I happened to be at home watching TV last night. Obviously, Chief Redden doesn't know any more about what I'm doing than what the students are doing." She went on to reassure reporters, however, that communist youth were just where they were supposed to be, in the thick of the struggle. In the event, the BSUs took Alexander's advice and declared victory on Friday, March 21st. At Carver, however, students and parents, led by Reverend Arthur Peters of Victory Baptist, continued to picket for several more days. Peters, renowned in the gospel music community, had made his church, just 2 blocks from Carver, the staging area for the struggle, and continued afterward to sponsor events for the Black Panthers and other Black Power groups. In 1975, he was found tortured to death, a victim of a serial killer in a case never solved. Aftershocks. The impressive demonstrations of student power on Los Angeles campuses inspired similar protests in nearby cities with Black minorities. A week after the conclusion of the LAUSD strike, an attempt to organize a BSU chapter at Duarte High School led to 2 days of clashes between Black and white students in the San Gabriel Valley suburb. In the meantime, administrators in Pasadena, site of an endless battle over school integration, had primed campuses for trouble. Black students at local high schools had been incensed by the exclusion of any girls of color from the song leader selections. After brief sit-ins at 5 schools, the administration included 1 Black teenager. She was suddenly disqualified in April. Simultaneously, a racist pamphlet was circulated on the Pasadena High School campus. "We must do something about the continual movement of Negroes toward becoming the dominant race at PHS." In fact, Blacks were barely 10% of the student body. An altercation between Black girls and their white PE instructors on April 30th led to arrests and the expulsion of 17 Black students. Blacks immediately went on strike at Pasadena, Muir, and Blair high schools, as well as at Washington Junior High. In Long Beach a few weeks later, a similar racist pamphlet at Poly High incited attacks on Blacks. who responded with a boycott. 2 days later, with black students rumored to be returning to campus, a large crowd of white teenagers assembled at a nearby park and marched to the school. More than 200 white students, reported the Times, shouting, "Get the niggers!" charged onto campus en masse Thursday morning. But black parents, warned of the ambush, had diverted their kids to the Martin Luther King Recreation Center, 6 blocks away. Chicano students showed up to express their solidarity, and the subsequent alliance between the two minorities quelled further mob attacks. But in San Bernardino that fall, white violence on campus led to a student strike followed by 4 days of rioting on the Black West Side. The trouble started in the second week of October when black students arriving at San Bernardino High School were stoned by a large group of white students. In the resultant melee, which involved hundreds of kids, there were a number of injuries, and the campus was shut down. Although whites had been the instigators, blacks were targeted for arrest and expulsion. A month later, after weeks of further skirmishes on campus, the police made a controversial arrest on the city's west side that brought hundreds of youth onto the streets. Mayor Al Ballard, a politician with a disturbing mafia connection, ordered a dusk-to-dawn curfew, armed firefighters with shotguns, and authorized the use of tear gas. Similar confrontations would recur in the city throughout the 1970s. The major backlash to the BSU strikes, however, was electoral. In addition to the defeat of Tom Bradley that fall, the far right seized control of the new 7-member LA Junior College Board in late May. Joseph Orozco, Reagan's former chief political representative in Southern California, led a victorious slate that included Mike Antonovich, a 29-year-old reserve cop who would eventually spend decades on the Board of Supervisors. They won on a platform that stressed 3 policies: kicking BSU and similar groups off campus, deploying police at the first sign of struggle, and, most importantly, no tax increase to hire more faculty or expand facilities at campuses like Southwest. At their inauguration, a chief supporter, Mrs. Floyd Wakefield, declared that the image of higher ed has been damaged by a few militants who are hell-bent on revolution, and it's time to make clear to all that higher education is a privilege. As a result of their fiscal stance in face of a growing budget deficit, 6,000 students were turned away at the beginning of the fall semester, and conditions continued to deteriorate at overcrowded campuses such as LACC. The victory of Yorty and the right of Reagan Republicans ended, at least for several years, any hope of liberal reform in city and school politics. With the doors slammed in their faces, young people of color and their white allies looked toward the revolution advocated by the Black Panther Party.